Those who start wars never fight them. And those who fight wars, they never like them. And those who write laws, they can recite them. And those of us who just fight laws, we live and die them. But I know they're never gonna tell you why, no. They only wanna tell you lies, no. Never ever gonna tell you why, no. They only wanna tell you lies, no. Never ever gonna tell you why, no. They only wanna tell you lies. It's time. It's time to go home. Don't take our boys away, no. Don't take our girls away, no. Don't take our boys away, no. Don't take our girls. It's time to go home. Don't take our boys away, no. Don't take our girls away, no. Don't take our boys away, no. Those who build walls are pretending that forever they can defend them. No, 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 no. No, 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 no. And those who dam streams can build fountains. Yes, they can. Yes, they can. But those of us who just let them run free, we can move mountains. But I know they're never gonna tell you why, no. They only wanna tell you lies, no. Never ever gonna tell you why, no. They only wanna tell you lies, no. Never ever gonna tell you why, no. They only wanna tell you lies. It's time. It's time to go home. Don't take our boys away, no. Don't take our girls away, no. Don't take our boys away, no. Don't take our girls. It's time to go home. Don't take our boys away, no. Don't take our girls away, no. Don't take our boys away, no. Flush it. Saw it coming. How many people never heard the warning? How many people never stayed home? How many people never heard the calling? How many people never saw it all? How many people did they spend it on? And how many people got to sing the song? And how many people never heard the crying? How many people gotten pushed aside? And how many people never saw the doves fly? How many people never said goodbye? And how many people never saw the falling? How many people till we ended all? And how many people never saw the wrong? And how many people did they drop the bomb on? Don't take our boys away, no. Don't take our girls away, no. Don't take our boys away, no. Don't take our girls away, no. Don't take our boys away, no. Don't take our girls away, no. Don't take our boys away. It's time to go home. Away, away, I'll be right away. No, away, 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 away. Take our boys away.
Say no matter what color Everybody wants to live together. Why can't we live together? Everybody wants to live together. Why can't we live together?
How many people would it who start wars never fight them. And those who fight wars, they never like them. And those who write laws, they can recite them. And those of us who just fight laws, we live and die them. But I know they're never gonna tell you why, no. They only wanna tell you lies, no. Never ever gonna tell you why, no. They only wanna tell you lies, no. Never ever gonna tell you why, no. They only wanna tell you lies. It's time. It's time to go home. Don't take our boys away, no. Don't take our girls away, no. Don't take our boys away, no. Don't take our girls. It's time to go home. Don't take our boys away, no. Don't take our girls away, no. Don't take our boys away, no. Those who build walls are pretending that forever they can defend them. No, 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 no. No, 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 no. And those who dam streams can build fountains. Yes, they can. Yes, they can. But those of us who just let them run free, we can move mountains. But I know they're never gonna tell you why, no. They only wanna tell you lies, no. Never ever gonna tell you why, no. They only wanna tell you lies, no. Never ever gonna tell you why, no. They only wanna tell you lies. It's time. It's time to go home. Don't take our boys away, no. Don't take our girls away, no. Don't take our boys away, no. Don't take our girls. It's time to go home. Don't take our boys away, no. Don't take our girls away, no. Don't take our boys away, no. It's time. It's time. How many people were they running from it? How many people never saw it coming? How many people never heard the warning? How many people never stayed at home? How many people never heard the calling? How many people never saw it all? How many people did they spend it on? And how many people got to sing the song? And how many people never heard the crying? How many people gotten pushed aside? And how many people never saw the doves fly? How many people never said goodbye? And how many people never saw the fall? And how many people till we ended all? And how many people never saw the wrong? And how many people did they drop the bomb on? Don't take our boys away, no. Don't take our girls away, no. Don't take our boys away, no. Don't take our girls away, no. Don't take our boys away, no. Don't take our girls away, no. Don't take our boys away. It's time to go home. Away, away, highway right. Away, no, away, 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 away. Take our boys away.
Say no matter what color Everybody wants to live together. Why can't we live together? Everybody wants to live together. Why can't we live together?
Those who start wars never fight them, and those who fight wars, they never like them, and those who write laws, they can recite them. Who just fight laws, we live and die them. But I know they're never gonna tell you why, no. They only wanna tell you lies, no. Never ever gonna tell you why, no. They only wanna tell you lies, no. Never ever gonna tell you why, no. They only wanna tell you lies. It's time to go home. Don't take our boys away, no. Don't take our girls away, no. Don't take our boys away, no. Don't take our girls. It's time to go home. Don't take our boys away, no. Don't take our girls away, no. Don't take our boys away, no.
Hello. Hello, I understand there's a few people waiting outside. If you'd like to come through, take a seat and we'll get going in a couple of minutes. Thank you.
And those who dam streams can build fountains. Yes, they can. Yes, they can. But those of us who just let them run free, we can move mountains. What I know, they're never gonna tell you why. time to go home. Don't take our boys away now. Don't take our girls away now. Don't take our boys away now. Don't take our girls. It's time to go home. Don't take our boys away now. Don't take our girls away now. Don't take our boys away now.
Good afternoon, brothers, sisters, comrades and friends. Welcome to Conway Hall. Welcome to this Stop the War event. My name is Shelly. I'm the chair of the Stop the War Coalition. It's a pleasure to see you all today. It's been a long time since I've been at a meeting of this kind, where there's not a computer screen between myself and the fellow panellists, and indeed between myself and your lovely selves. So it feels very special to be here, if not a little bit strange. Now, we're of course here to mark 20 years of the Stop the War Coalition, which was formed in the advent of the War on Terror, the invasion of Afghanistan, later Iraq, and of course since then we've campaigned on Yemen, Syria, Libya, Iran, Palestine, the Cold War on China, the associated effects of the War on Terror, racism, climate catastrophe, all of which we'll be talking about today. We've massively shifted popular opinion. One of our former chairs even almost went on to become Prime Minister, and I hear that he'll be along later this afternoon. So we'll be looking back at the last couple of decades, but we'll also be looking towards the future and thinking about what kind of priorities and tactics does the anti-war movement need to adopt to bring about a more peaceful future. We're here for 3 hours. We've got 4 sessions, loads of fantastic speakers. There'll be a few breaks as well, so you can find your way to the toilet, maybe grab an empanada from the Chilean Independence Day Festival that's happening outside. I first of all have to give apologies from Tariq Ali today. He was due to join us on this first panel, but unfortunately he's not very well. It is a massive shame because Tariq, of course, has played a really important role in Stop the War and has been a lifelong anti-war campaigner. So we send him very best wishes for a speedy recovery and regret that he's not able to be here today. There are some other really important people that I want to pay tribute to before we kick off, who have been integral to Stop the War over the last 20 years, and starting with a few names of those comrades who are sadly no longer with us. Tony Benn, Robin Best, Tam Dial, Helen John, Mark Marcusset, and Walter Wolfgang. I also want to pay tribute to those comrades who are still with us but are not going to be here today, or will not be hearing from them today, unfortunately, but have nonetheless played a really important part in this campaign. Anas Altikriti, Andrew Bergin, Laura Dubinsky, George Galloway, Rose Gentle, Joe Glenton, Billy Hayes, Joan Humphreys, Bruce Kent, Reg Keys, Paul Mackney, Alice Mann, Carmel Nolan, John Pilger, Murad Qureshi, Garda Razuki, Ased Rayman, Shahid Salim, Jane Shallis, Dr. Gayasuddin Siddiqui, Carol Turner, Shahida Vauda, and David Wilson. Big round of applause for those as well. Now, to kick us off for this first session, how it began, I would like to introduce one of the co-founders of the Stop the War Coalition, a former chair and the current chief of staff of Unite the Union, one of our affiliate unions, Andrew Murray. Andrew.
Yeah, thank you, Shelley. I'm the former chair that did not nearly become Prime Minister. There may be time yet, but I think if we're looking for chairs to become Prime Ministers, our hopes now rest on Shelley at some point in the future. I can already tell this is a much better meeting than the one 20 years ago at which Stop the War was founded, which was one of the most acrimonious and disputatious meetings I've ever attended, and I think Lindsey at the time did brilliantly to hold that meeting together. And I would actually just like to start by paying a personal tribute to Lindsey German for the fantastic work she's done over 20 years. And I'm very proud to have worked alongside her in the Stop the War Coalition. Now, you could boil down our record over the last 20 years into 3 words. We were right. Everything that we said 20 years ago, and most of what we've said since, has been borne out by events, and that has been dramatically highlighted by what's just happened in Afghanistan. We were right about Afghanistan when we said that the terrorist attacks of 9/11 should be treated as a crime, not an act of war, and when we said that occupying Afghanistan would lead to disaster. We are right, and it's been shown that that war of intervention has been the longest and bloodiest way to get from point A back to point A again. 20 years, tens of thousands of lost lives, a country destroyed, and a region destabilised. We were right, and it was brought home to me why we were right in a little article in the Wall Street Journal, of all places, in the last few weeks in the aftermath of this calamity in Afghanistan, where a journalist said that in 2002, 2003, the newly installed Afghan government wanted to open peace talks with the Taliban to get an inclusive and united government. They were vetoed by the Americans. Vetoed. And that shows that this was imperialist power denying the sovereignty of an Afghan government that they had themselves more or less installed to seek a peaceful solution to that country's problems. And the subsequent destruction and bloodshed is on the hands of the American and the British governments above all, and we were right to oppose them. We were right, of course, about Iraq as well. I don't think I need to dwell on that point particularly, but I would just like to emphasise how Stop the War, we had to take a decision, because some people in the peace movement around the world, they were against the war in Iraq, but once the war was over and it's settling down to occupation, they all said, let's make the best of it. Let's get behind the occupation. We said, you cannot oppose the crime and then support its consequences. We oppose the occupation, and it's the occupation of Iraq as much as the original war that wrecked and destroyed that country. So we were right about Iraq, and we have been vindicated by everything that has happened since. We were right. We were right about Libya. We didn't have hundreds of thousands of people on the streets protesting against the war in Libya, but we did warn in a pamphlet, I think I wrote it with Chris Nineham as far as I remember, saying a war on Libya will risk tearing that country apart. And of course it has done, and we've seen the consequences in terms of the massive suffering in Libya, the migrant crisis in the Mediterranean, and more. We were right in the calls that we have made, the critical decisions in the last 20 years. And frankly, world politics would have been much better if Stop the War Coalition, rather than the Labour and Tory governments, had been directing the foreign policy of this country, and we should not be ashamed to say that. And we were right not because of any alchemy, or because our opponents are necessarily stupid people, when they went all George Bush, but we were right because we said that the peaceful solution of disputes and an outlook informed by anti-imperialism is a better guide to solving the problems of the world than the doctrines of interventionism, of great power politics, and of the supremacy of Britain and the United States of America. It was that outlook which has been vindicated. Now, there's a nincompoop called Wayne David, who's a Labour MP. He's actually been appointed by Keir Starmer shadow minister for the Middle East and North Africa. Now, this man, Wayne David, he's supported the Iraq war, he supported the Libyan intervention, he supported the Afghan war. So basically, he's been put in, if he became minister, I don't know what the countries in the Middle East and North Africa are supposed to make of him, because he's in favour, basically, of invading and overthrowing all their governments whenever he wants. Anyway, I'm not making that particular point. My point is, he said recently that the Labour Party must drop its obsession with anti-imperialism. Now, you will find no one around the world who believes that the main problem with the Labour Party has been its obsession with anti-imperialism. It's been the obsession with imperialism of Tony Blair to Wayne David and Keir Starmer that is going to undermine the Labour Party's future, and we are right to fight against it. Now, dwelling for a moment on nincompoops, there's been a massive amount of criticism to stop the war over the last 20 years, and that's fine, that goes with the turf. But I was researching something else the other day when I came across what I still think is the most priceless attack on Stop the War in these 20 years, and it was delivered by Martin Kettle, one of the college of constipated centrists that stopped the Guardian's comment pages. And he said back in 2006, the anti-war movement was right about the war, but wrong about everything else. Well, it's a bit like saying the Beatles were all right at music, but hopeless at putting out fires. I mean, but the fact is that not only was the anti-war movement right about the war, which is actually our raison d'etre, we weren't there to address any other particular problems, we were actually right about other things as well. We were right to say that this course of war would pollute our own society, that it would lead to an increase in racism and Islamophobia, that it would menace civil liberties, and that is what has happened in our country and in many other countries across the world, and putting opposition to a racist backlash that has primarily been borne by Muslims in this country was again absolutely the right thing to do, whether the Guardian acknowledges it or not. Now, we can be proud too of the movement that we built around these principles. And I'd just like to just spend a second on it. I mean, firstly, Stop the War Coalition united the left. Not easy. Never easy. And let's remember, I mean, even a couple of years before we were founded, when there was the attack on Yugoslavia, the left was all over the place, basically, on that war. I'm not going to go down that particular issue now, but uniting the left around basic, clear principles of support for peace, opposition to war, opposition to racism, and defence of civil liberties, that was key. We also had the support initially of a small number of smaller militant trade unions, but then in the end, virtually the entire trade union movement, and that was a strength. We can be proud of the support we had from school students around the country who walked out from school against war, giving the lie to the idea they were an apathetic generation, and many of those school students I now bump into in other contexts, much older now, playing a part in politics. I am particularly proud of our association with the Muslim community, with individual Muslim leaders like Salma Yaqoob, who's speaking later, with the Muslim Association of Britain in particular as an organisation. We helped build a fighting alliance of the left, of many communities, with British Muslims for the first time. And again, I was proud, and actually I was told by a special branch officer, if you must know, we didn't go into all the circumstances, when he actually said, and he worked this, that what we had done more for community relations in this country with building alliances with the Muslim community than any government programme. And this was back before print. So we can be proud of that too. We can be proud of the Military Families Alliance, where we were able to build unity with the parents of those who had lost their sons in Iraq and Afghanistan and who found the courage to say they died for a false cause. And we built that alliance, and that was something entirely unprecedented that, again, I think will resonate and certainly rattled the establishment. And I'm also proud that we did not run away from the Iraqi people in particular when they were resisting the illegal occupation. You may remember, or some of you may, I think it was 2006, we held a conference with political representatives of the Iraqi resistance there. And it is right that we did so, because we have to stand in solidarity with people who are campaigning and working against the criminal policies of our government being carried out in their country, and that, again, is something of great significance that we did that. So, I'm proud of our record, but we also have to look to the future, and much of today's programme, I believe, will be doing that. We said, right 20 years ago, the wars we have been dragged into now are only the foothills of greater conflicts. And when we look at what was announced this week in terms of the, I'm not going to try and pronounce the acronym, but it's called MERD in French, this alliance of Australia, the UK and the US, new Cold War arms race in the Far East directed against China, we are now seeing existing imperialist alliances breaking up or threatened, new ones being formed, and the dangers of still greater wars, not perhaps the war on terror type interventions, but worse wars. And we will have to fight, campaign in new ways, in alliances with a new range of people to discharge our mandate of stopping the war. And these are vital for the future of our country and our politics. We had, as Shelly alluded to it, a tremendous achievement, and one of Stop the War's longest-standing supporters became leader of the Labour Party. Things are now going into reverse there. But I do say this, if the Labour Party abandons the politics of peace and justice and wraps itself in the flag, if it turns its back on the sort of forces that Stop the War coalition mobilised, then the Labour Party will have no future as a progressive force in this country. Now, comrades, just to conclude, there are obviously many things I look back on and think we could have done better, we should have done better, and many things that we take pride in. I particularly remember an occasion, I think it was after the peak of the war in Iraq, when we were still holding very large demonstrations. They were very large by any standards other than the previous demonstrations we'd organised. And after one of them, we got messages from people in Iraq saying they'd seen our demonstration on television and how heartened they were to know that there were tens and hundreds of thousands of people in Britain demonstrating against the war and the occupation that was ravaging the country. And that, I think, is our achievement. I don't want to end on a hyperbolic note, but I just want to say that I think what we have done is we have planted the standard of opposition to war and opposition to imperialism. We have rallied hundreds of thousands and millions of people to it here in the heartland of one of the oldest and bloodiest empires in the world. And in doing that, I think we've made a decent contribution to the future of humanity.
Thank you so much, Andrew. And as you spelled out at the beginning there, we were right and the nincompoops and the constipated centrists were wrong. But no, seriously, a huge amount to be proud of, both from the positions that we've taken and the coalitions that we've built. And if Andrew has not given you good reason enough and you haven't yet joined Stop the War, I want to just take an opportunity to encourage you to please join. The stand outside, you can do so there, you can also do so online. And before I introduce our next speaker, just a couple more things to note. This meeting has cost money, and a lot of the things that we do cost money. You can donate to Stop the War using this QR code on the back of your programmes here. Just hold your phone up to it. There are also ways to donate outside as well. We are launching an appeal today, so we'll be very, very grateful to anything that you can spare to go towards that. Another thing is, has anyone here seen our exhibition? Yes, fantastic. So today is not the only thing we're doing to mark our 20 years anniversary. We also have an exhibition at Beaux Arts. Tomorrow is the last opportunity to go and see it. It's on until 10 till 4 tomorrow, so please do have a look. You can see some fantastic things around the room which sort of reference some of the artwork that you can see there, but it's really brilliant. Banksy pieces, Peter Kennard, David Gentleman, so do go and check it out if you're still around in London tomorrow. I'm now going to hand over to our next speaker, without whom none of this, frankly, would be possible. One of the other founders of Stop the War and our convener, Lindsey German.
Thank you very much, Shelley, and thank you, Andrew, for your kind words. And thanks to everybody here. I mean, when people talk about, the contribution of Stop the War, we should remember that there wouldn't be the contribution if it wasn't for literally millions of people around this country who gave out leaflets, who booked coaches, who argued with people at work, who got resolutions through their trade unions, school students who went out on strike and did all of those things, and many, many more things as well. If all of us hadn't done that, and many, many people obviously who aren't here, but who did that over the years, there wouldn't have been this movement. We wouldn't have been able to challenge the government. We wouldn't have been in a position to say that this war is so wrong. And Andrew's made the point that 20 years ago, we said we shouldn't go to war, and we've been proved right. I just think it's worth going through one particular argument then, because of course Stop the War was formed as a result of what happened on 9/11, and we've seen in recent weeks the commemorations of 9/11, and of course it brings it all back to you, the terrible things that people suffered in New York and Washington, and the 3,000 people who died as a result of that day. And of course we were told by George Bush that this war on terror was a war which would stop terrorism, would actually make the world a safer place. I mean, somebody's laughed in the audience and you can see why, except it's not funny in the sense that we have now had 20 years where terrorism has got worse and actually has been created in exactly the places where we went to war to say we were doing it to stop terrorism. If you look at ISIS, ISIS was formed in the prisons of British-occupied Iraq back in 2007-2008. If you look at IS in Afghanistan, created in a situation where you have an occupation by US, British, Canadian, German and other Western troops. So in other words, far from it being the case that we've dealt with terrorism, we've made the situation worse. We've made the world a more dangerous place, a more unstable place, a place where all the ideas of terrorism, far from being dealt with, have been able to grow. And it seems to me that when we look at that, we need to say that that has its roots in what we argued after 9/11 and what our governments argued after 9/11. Because we said, however bad 9/11 is, it is not the justification for war. And if you remember, George Bush said immediately after, he said, it's not an act of terror, it's an act of war. And that was because the people who were around Bush, the Project for a New American Century, the Wolfowitzes, the Rumsfelds, all those people, they were determined to go to war, regardless of the consequences. They went to war in Afghanistan, one of the poorest countries in the world. They defeated the Taliban very, very quickly. 20 years later, where are we? We're back with the Taliban in control of Afghanistan, and with it remains one of the poorest countries in the world. You just imagine if the $2 trillion that the Americans have spent on the war in Afghanistan, if that had gone into infrastructure, and not just military infrastructure, which is what they spent it on roads and bridges to actually facilitate the war, if it had gone on to helping people, to abolishing poverty, to getting education for everybody who needed it, for getting rid of joblessness and homelessness and all the other things that the Afghan people suffered, what a different picture the world would have today and how much further forward we would be rather than the position they took us into. So I think when we look at why we were right, it's very important that we do say that we were right in our basic analysis. We were also right in saying they will plunge the world into a war. I remember speaking at the first demonstration we had over Afghanistan in Trafalgar Square, and I said, we are going to see war without end in the name of democracy. And this is what we've been seeing for the last 20 years. And far from it being democracy, we now have millions of people homeless, millions of people who are refugees, and what happens to them when they get to this country, and most of them don't get to this country, most of them are in Pakistan or Iran, or one of the neighbouring countries. When they do get to this country, what happens to them? They are treated in the most abominable fashion. We have a Home Secretary that is sending people on jet skis to turn round dinghies in the English Channel to send them back to France. What kind of a ruinous politic is that we've created? And what have we done? What have we done in terms of Islamophobia? You know, we've created a unique movement with Stop the War. There have been many very, very powerful anti-war movements before that and peace movements, notably CND in this country, but all sorts of other ones as well. What Stop the War did, and it was a major achievement, was that we brought together the left, the trade union movement, the peace movement, the Muslim community. And I think people still don't understand how important that was for the Muslim community and for those of us who aren't Muslims to come together to say we can unite against this war. We do want to involve everybody in this question. And the first demonstration we had was during Ramadan. Some of you will remember it, in Trafalgar Square, over Afghanistan 20 years ago. we were very nervous, but we asked an imam to come along and break the fast for Ramadan at 4:20 in the afternoon, and people handed out dates and water to the crowd. And that had an amazing effect on people because it showed we're not having a separate Muslim anti-war movement. We're not having a separate left anti-war movement. We're bringing everybody together. And I regard it as one of our biggest achievements that we managed to do that. And it's had implications since then over Palestine, over all sorts of things, where again, we saw tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people out on the streets in recent months. But that came at a tremendous cost to the Muslim community because they stood up and were counted over the war, and they've been treated as though they're extremists and pariahs and terrorists ever since. And it is an absolute shame of this government that it's encouraged Islamophobia with the Prevent agenda. It's encouraged division between people. It's encouraged all those sorts of things. And again, we have to stand up and be counted against that. Now, that movement, what did we achieve? You hear people say, what did we do? We didn't stop the war. And I think it's to our greatest regret, all of us, that we weren't able to stop the invasion of Iraq. I think we came close. Donald Rumsfeld phoned Tony Blair and said, you don't have to go to war, but Blair was absolutely determined to go to war. But what did we achieve? We didn't stop the war. We did stop future land invasions. The Afghan and Iraq invasions were the last of the invasions of those sort. We did stop David Cameron launching air attacks on Syria in 2013 as he wanted to. We stopped that going through Parliament, and that was a huge achievement. We changed public opinion in this country. If you look at the latest polls, what do they say? Majority of people, we should never have gone to war in Afghanistan. And that's a tremendous thing for us to have been able to do, and we have to continue to do that. We also made it impossible for Tony Blair to lead a normal political life in this country. I don't suppose Tony Blair wants to walk into a pub anywhere in London and have a drink, but I can't imagine him walking into one anywhere, or in Manchester or in Birmingham or anywhere else, without people coming up to him and saying, you're a war criminal, you shouldn't be here, you should be in The Hague. And that's something that I'm very proud of. Andrew referred to Labour under the present leadership. I think it is an absolute disgrace that this week Labour's leadership stood up in Parliament, Keir Starmer and Lisa Nandy, and said how much they welcome the nuclear deal that's just been done between America and Britain and Australia. What an absolute disgrace that is. And I hope that everybody in the Labour Party and outside of the Labour Party will do everything we can to reverse this policy from Labour. It's not an aberration from the Labour leadership. Jeremy Corbyn was unfortunately an exception as Labour leader, but I know that many Labour members left over Iraq, left the party over Iraq and rejoined under Jeremy Corbyn. I know many Labour members have always opposed the war, and those are the people we want to support and we want to identify with. Just finally, can I say this, that to thank everybody for what they've done, but to say we're not at the end yet. The defeat for the US and Britain in Afghanistan was a very, very big defeat, and we should never forget that. It was a huge defeat for American imperialism in particular. But we know with the new signing of the AUKUS deal this week that they are talking about further confrontation with China, further militarization of the war, increased amount of nuclear proliferation. All of these things are going to go on. We should also remember what safety for people really means. They talk about safety, they talk about taking care of people. What does safety mean? It means freedom from fear of climate change. It means freedom from fear from the pandemic, which we've seen the governments make such an awful mess of over the last 2 years, and still the people in the poorest countries are suffering the worst from lack of vaccinations and lack of medical care. It means freedom from fear for refugees, the people who are escaping war and yet can't find a safe haven anywhere in the richest countries in the world. That's what the future's about, that's what it stands for, and that is why Stop the War will continue to campaign, will continue to organise and continue to build demonstrations, protests over what they're doing, with what Biden's doing around China, what Boris Johnson is doing. These are things we're going to continue to do, and I hope that we'll continue to have your support. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Lindsey. And I just want to pay a personal tribute to both you, Lindsey, and Andrew, and give you a big thank you for your dedication, your encouragement, and your leadership of this campaign and the movement over these last 20 years. Thank you so much. Lindsey mentioned this new alliance between the US, the UK, and Australia, and we will be having a meeting on that very soon. So if you're not on the mailing list, sign up and you'll be able to find out information about when that will happen. Now, our next speaker, I last saw him, welcomed him to the stage at an event that Stop the War hosted called Artists Against Trump, ahead of Trump's first visit to the UK, and he did a fantastic reading. It is a joy and an honour to again introduce multi-award-winning actor, playwright, director, peace advocate, and long-time supporter of Stop the War, Mark Rylance.
I can't tell you what a deep pleasure it is for me just to be with you in the same room. Not because of the pandemic, but because of our work together on this cause. I'm increasingly surprised as I'm going to take my hat off to you, not wear it today on purpose. I'm increasingly surprised that professional liars like me get invited to talk anywhere in front of people. But and particularly in a hall that I looked up and saw, oh, what's it say up at the top of the stage, Mark? To thine own self be true. I think we're a remarkable group of people, and I think of that sentence up there, and it's, of course, there's true in it, and all this last month I've been thinking of what to speak with you about, and thinking of this old phrase that Sir Francis Bacon wrote, not far from here actually, what is truth, said jesting Pilate, and would not stay the answer. Do you know that essay? It's quite a good essay on truth. So we've got up here, to thine own self be true. I think the thing that marks us out is not only our hunger for truth, and thank God for people like Lindsey and Andrew and everyone involved here in terms of sending me the emails over these last 20 years that have kept me informed about things. So truth is important. I want to come back to that. But I think also this word self is very, very vital in this movement, in that I take it that we're all here and part of this because we don't have a sense of self that stops here, or a sense of self that stops here with our partner, or stops here with our child or our children, or stops here with our neighborhood or our council or our city or our country, or Europe, or people who speak English. But we have a sense of self that includes all people. And when someone's child dies, or someone's family is decimated, or someone has depleted uranium dropped into their neighborhood, and their descendants for 50,000 years will be poisoned, we include that as ourself, as much as we can. I haven't prepared anything today because I just want to be with you really and speak not as a celebrity but just as a citizen of the world, in the way that we are inspired by this wonderful organization and all the work that they put in to think of the world as one. That we're not different. We're on a sinking ship, aren't we? Certainly feels like it, for many reasons. But one of the first and most crucial steps we could do on that sinking ship to let the plants and the animals and the whole planet have some chance of survival is to stop fighting wars, isn't it? It's probably the number one thing, one benefit that we could do to help ourselves to survive. Anyway, so who am I here to even speak in front of you, other than a supporter and someone who's taken a chance to stand up in front of you at times and sing a song or read a poem or use other people's words to express some moment? What do I know about? What do I know about imperialism? Well, we actors know a little bit about it, actually. We are trained, I'm now 40 years an actor, in how to control a crowd, how to control the people and steer them through my interpretation of a play or a little group interpretation. And if I get a laugh on Tuesday night, and it's a big laugh and everyone enjoys it, you're right, the next night I'm going to try and do it exactly the same. Now that's a pleasurable imperialism perhaps, but I'm still trying to control you and give you an experience which I think is the best experience or the right experience. That when Olivia in Twelfth Night says, "Oh, wonderful," when she sees there are two versions of the man she loves, that I want to do that, be standing in a certain way, say it in a certain way, that it gets the same laugh that it got last night, and maybe for 300 nights if I've done it for a while. When I came to the Globe, and for the first time the lights were on, and I could see you, the audience, and I wasn't just playing into darkness, into my imagination of what you were, I had to learn a lesson, which was I could see that this sense of saying or doing things in the right way, in the ideal way, in my own mind, was actually limiting me from being here in the room with you. Because often I might say, "Oh, wonderful," and it'd be less of a laugh than the night before. And I would think, "Oh, I didn't do it so well," or "This isn't such a good crowd." No, it was just a different crowd. So if there was one thing I said to other actors when they came to the Globe Theatre over my 10 years that I was there, was don't speak to the audience. Don't speak for the audience even. Certainly don't speak at the audience. Speak with them. To be or not to be, that is the question. It's something we share. I'm saying, do you agree? I'm not telling you, I'm proposing it. That's the question. That is the question. So there's a very particular subtle change as an actor that I do know about between someone who tries to control and get the audience to do exactly what I think is good for them, and best for the play, and someone who just thinks this play is a chance for us to be together and experience some things that might be very overwhelming in our own lives. Do you see the difference? This way of thinking, I credit as one of the things that's been a benefit of being a part of Stop the War. Because I look around I think of the causes of these wars that are such a horror, and a lot of them are to do with idealists, aren't they? A lot of them to do with people just like us here today. And I agree, I feel wonderful that we were right. But I also immediately we say we were right, I think, oh, Saddam Hussein thought he was right. Our friend there thinks still he was right, or certainly gives that impression. So this thing of being right for yourself and to thine own self be true, and imposing that rightness on other people, that goes on in a small way in our own neighborhoods, doesn't it? It goes on in ourselves as well. When we find things in ourselves that we think don't live up to the standard, or perhaps as a part of our own self that isn't really acceptable in society. Do we go in and suppress that? Do we go in and try and eradicate it? Some of the ways we treat disease in our NHS, I think, are similar to the way we do wars. We see that there's a little terrorist unit in this city, and we're going to get that terrorist unit with pinpoint radiation, pinpoint chemotherapy, and there will be no collateral damage. We're just going to take it out, and then we'll be well. The truth of the matter is, often there's enormous inflammation and collateral damage in the body. Now that can be dealt with, and I'm not against some of these procedures when it's an emergency. But I was shocked to find from young doctors, how many days do you think they spend on nutrition in their 4 years training? Half a day, I was told. Half a day, and that's voluntary. Half a day. Thank you. We seem to behave the same way in terms of identifying people in the world that we think are crazy or wrong or doing all kinds of, we'll just go in and take them out. It'll be clear, simple. We'll just cut it out and that'll be problem solved. There's the comparisons of how much money we invest in military violent solutions of conflict compared to how much we invest in peaceful resolution of conflict is just staggering. And very similar, I think, to the way we treat our bodies, the way we treat the body of civilization. I hesitate to use that word these days, of humanity on the planet. I was struck the other day by a wonderful video of Michael Moore feeling the same way that we do, that he was right. And I was shamed to see his speech at the Academy Awards when he was given an award, like I was given an award once for making the Fahrenheit documentary, and he was speaking about the same things they'd awarded him for. You've probably seen that video. And they boo and hiss him in the most shameful way. The microphone platform lowers, the music raises, and they just put him aside. But he in the interview, they had a wonderful quote, which I wonder if you know who said this. Every gun made, every warship launched, every rocket fired signifies, in the final sense, a theft from those who hunger and are not fed, who are cold and are not clothed. Eisenhower. So how do we control ourselves and move positively? How do we move positively and learn? Because yes, hopefully there will be no war at some point, but it's a long shot. It's a long path, isn't it? So we might as well enjoy the road as we're going along. We might as well learn from it as we're going along. I certainly feel that way. And I'm thinking that one of the things I'll end with now, because I should end, is why, carrying on this thought of why do wars happen on the microcosm and the larger stage too. Of course, there's a lot of money to be made, isn't there? 300 million a day. Did you hear that the other day? That's Forbes magazine, the billionaires magazine. Did you have something to add to that? No, 300 million a day. And there are still bills to pay, too. So you paid 300 million a day, but still there's bills to come up. That's what it's cost America to be in Afghanistan a day for 20 years. You can imagine where that money would have been spent. So there are people who want to make these wars, politicians for fame, businesses for money, but they wouldn't happen unless our young people signed up. So we've got to look at what is it that's drawing the young people to go out and fight. Soon they'll just be robots, it'll be different. But we've got to look at that. A very good book I want to finish on recommending to you is this, A Terrible Love of War by the Jungian psychologist James Hillman. And it's a fascinating book. He's not a warmonger at all, but he tries to understand what the love of war is. And he comes to a very interesting conclusion, which is that soldiers have an experience in war they cannot find anywhere else in civilian life. And what is that experience? He calls it ethical intimacy. Much to his surprise, he finds this, ethical intimacy. And that is that your platoon of 6 men or 20 men, you may be walking through a very dangerous place, one of you gets wounded, you will go out into that dangerous place, even though you may be wounded or killed yourself, and rescue the member of your squadron or platoon and bring them back. That's an act of ethical intimacy. Unless we can find similar experiences for our young people in peace, they will be drawn and tempted towards war. And that's the same for us too, isn't it? Unless we are happy to just be with each other and not dominate or put onto each other our ideals, we also may not be able to stop the war. Anyway, as I said, I can't express my thanks more deeply to all the work that you've done and everyone that they've named. I want to name Brian Hoare too, the wild Brian Hoare. We marched that day, and we marched many days, but he stood 24 hours a day, didn't he? What an inspiration and a symbol. He was an angry man, wasn't he? But he stood with that Zimmer frame at the end. Remember passing by or going by, and they were still standing, taking one hand up for the megaphone. Stop killing kids. 24 hours a day for 10 years. Well, we've got a lovely little statue that we're working to find a place for opposite the Imperial War Museum so that he will always stand there. I'll come back to you with more news about it. I'd like the costs really be covered by £1 a person. £1. No one can give more than £1. So that it's a good thousands of us that stand behind Brian, and we put him there facing the Imperial War Museum. Thank you so much for inviting me to speak today.
Thank you so much, Mark, for those words and for your support over the years. A pleasure to have you with us. And thank you again to Lindsey and Andrew. I'm going to hand over swiftly now the chair to Chris, because the next session on Iraq is going to run immediately after this one. Thanks, comrades.
Thanks very much, everyone. Just give us a couple of minutes to assemble the new platform. And if Kate Hudson is in the house, could she come onto the stage as well, please? Okay, hello everyone. It's great to see so many people in the flesh, so to speak, at last after so long. I've been asked to chair this session, but I've also been asked just to say a few words before we start about the international movement against war, which I was involved with around the Iraq war. And I guess most of you know it, but the demonstration on February the 15th, 2003 wasn't just the biggest demonstration ever in Britain, it was a global protest. And actually it was the biggest mobilization of human beings in history anywhere on the globe. There were protests in at least 600 cities in all 7 continents, including Antarctica, creatively, involving about, people estimate 30 million, at least 30 million people around the world. It was an intensely dramatic moment. The demonstrations followed the sun from the South Pacific, Australia, through North, South Asia, through Russia, parts of Africa, and then into Europe. Spain, Italy had their biggest demonstrations ever, the same as us, and then across the Atlantic,
troops,
500,000
the world
in New
can
York,
now see
cities
the
right
disaster
across
that
North
has
South
been.
America.
And we see that 20 years and a return
day,
of
and
the
it didn't stop the war, as
Taliban and
Lindsey
trillions
said.
of dollars
I think
spent
it
and
has had a
countless
huge,
lives of Afghans
impact.
lost,
It
as well as
showed
thousands of our own
that
soldiers,
the wars
has
were
only
contested.
fed this war machine
It created a situation in which
that
the wars
continues to be
were
hungry for the next war.
inextricably bound
And
up
that's why it's so
with
important that we
opposition,
come
popular
together
protest,
across the
and,
Atlantic,
a kind of,
the UK and the US
confrontation from
particularly,
public opinion.
to stop the
And
next
this
war,
point
which
was
they are
widely
aiming for,
recognised,
which
not
is a
just by
war
us,
on China.
at the time,
Most
but also
recently,
by sections
we
of the
see how the US and
Famously,
the UK
on Monday,
have
the
convinced
17th
the
of February,
Australians not to work
the
with
New York
France,
Times
but
ran an
with
editorial
our
saying
countries
that despite
and
the end of
our
the Cold
companies
War, that
to
despite all the
produce
talk
these
about the US being the
nuclear-powered
sole
submarines
world power,
that is only
quotes,
fueling
there may
the
still be 2
tension
superpowers
in the
on
South
the
China
planet,
Seas
the United
and
States of
fueling
America
a conflict
and
with
world
China.
public opinion.
It's interesting how it was France
And I think-
early on, before going into the war in Iraq, that warned
I don't
us
think it's an exaggeration
and said,
to say
this
that
is not a good
confrontation is
idea.
still playing
And now
out,
we see France being
today.
pushed out,
And I
the
just wanted to make a few
war
very
hawk
quick points
countries
about
of
it,
the
and
US and
particularly
the
make the point
UK
that this movement
fueling
wasn't spontaneous.
this new conflict.
It
So
involved
once
organisation.
again,
It depended
we have
first of
so
all on
much
the
work
fact
to
that
do to get our
people in
countries
Britain
out of the
actually
Middle East,
had been going flat
to
out
stop
for
a new
year
war from China,
before
with
that
China,
demonstration to
and
build the
also
movement.
to
We had a
stop our
demonstration
countries
in
from selling
September
or
2002,
giving
which was like
weapons to
400,000
the most
strong, and then there
repressive
was a
countries around
demonstration
the
in
world,
October in Italy,
including
and they proved
Israel,
that you could
Egypt,
mobilise
Saudi
large
Arabia,
numbers of
and the
people
United
against
Arab
war.
Emirates.
And that was important
So I look
as a kind of
forward to
launch pad for the
continuing
demo. It was
to
also
work with
boosted
you
by
at the Stop the War Coalition
pre-existing
so that we can
international
change our
networks around
government's
the
foreign
anti-capitalist
policies.
movement.
We can stop
We went
the
to the European
madness
Social
of
Forum
fueling
in
this
Italy,
war
where there were
machine,
70,000
and we can get on
people.
track
We
to
put
have our
the
countries
proposal for a demo
focusing
there.
on
We actually went to
diplomacy,
Brazil,
on the real
to,
threats to
the
our
World Social
world,
Forum, where
which
there
is
was
the climate
150,000
crisis
people. We got the
and
biggest
the
assembly
pandemic we
there,
now face,
20,000
global
people in one
poverty
meeting,
and global
singing,
racism,
Don't
and
attack
stop
Iraq in
fueling
Portuguese,
hatred,
which
war,
conveniently
and
is now
militarism.
attacking Iraqi.
Stop the
so
war.
it kind of,
Let's
had
do
a
it.
global flavour to it. So that was very, very important. And there was
Hi,
some resistance.
my name is Medea Benjamin,
but we won
and I'm with the peace
argument
group
in the
called
worldwide
Code Pink
movement.
in the United
and
States.
I think it's important
and it's a
to say
great
that there
honor
was
for me
resistance because
to
there were
address the
strong
Stop the War
arguments
Coalition,
where people were
our
saying,
wonderful ally
actually
over
in
this
the
last 20
movement,
years.
that
I'll never
opposing
forget
the war
when we
might
were
be
together
divisive,
at the
that
World
we should
Social
stick to
Forum,
economic questions,
and Chris
that
Nineham
we'd lose
and
the
others
middle
from the Stop the War
ground,
Coalition
that
said,
we
why
would
don't we
never
have a
be able to
global
get large
day
number
of
of
action
large numbers of
to
people out
protest
on the
the
streets against
upcoming
war. And we had to argue
threat
hard
of war in Iraq.
that any
And
progressive
there was a
movement
roar
worth its
from the
name
crowd, and we said,
has to
yes,
be
let's do
in the
it. And
21st
indeed, there
century
was that
anti-war,
February
has to be
15,
anti-imperialist,
2003
because if it's
day
not,
that the
not
world
only will
said
it be
no
weakened,
to war.
but it will be fatally
And while we weren't able to
compromised.
stop the war,
We'd seen
we
earlier
certainly
to prove
reflected
this
the
point
global
that the
sentiment
anti-globalisation
against
in the
going
United
into
States
war.
at the time,
And we've
which was quite
continued to
powerful,
do that for
was
the
completely
last 20
silenced by
years,
9/11
to
because it
point
wasn't
out
able
the
to
lies,
answer
the
it.
destruction,
So I'll say
the
it again just to
horrors
conclude.
of
I mean,
these
the
20
demonstrations
years
may not have
of
stopped the war, but I
response
think
to the
they had a
9/11
huge,
attacks.
huge impact.
In
They
the case of
created,
Afghanistan,
actually,
it was
a
easy
crisis,
to
not
convince
just for the
people to
British
go to
government,
war
but for other
because, at
governments
least
other
in the
parts of
U.S.,
the
there was
world.
a thirst
They have
for
created a
revenge.
situation where
but when
now
it came to
the
Iraq,
kind of
it was
Afghanistan,
harder.
Iraq,
and that's why
boots
our
on the ground
governments,
type of
including
invasion,
Tony Blair in
is
the UK,
no longer
had to
politically
lie
possible
to the
for the
people,
Western
telling
powers,
us
and
that there
that's
were
very
weapons of
important
mass
and very
destruction when there
significant.
weren't, telling us that there were ties
Unsurprisingly,
between
the
Saddam
anniversary
Hussein and
of
Al-Qaeda when
9/11,
there weren't.
in the
And I remember
mainstream,
going
on the
to
media,
Iraq with
hasn't
a group
involved
of
any
women
kind of
from the
discussion
United
about the
States
mass
before the
movements.
U.S. began the
And that's why I
bombing,
think it's very
and women
important that we
telling us,
remember these
please,
events
we
and
do
we,
not like Saddam
learn
Hussein,
from and-
but we
and
don't want you
continue
to liberate
the
us
legacy of these
with your
events. We have
bombs.
to keep it in mind.
And we see
because
how
it
that,
shows what
quote,
the left can do when it's
liberation has
organised,
been so
ambitious,
disastrous for the
and
people
radical,
of Iraq.
actually.
Our friends
But it
there
shows
are
also
either
that ordinary
dead,
people
maimed,
don't have to be
dispersed
silent,
around
don't
the
have
world.
to be sidelined,
And
even by
we here in the
international
United
global
States
events that feel as
barely
if
even
they're
talk about
completely
all of the violence
overpowering. And
that we
unfortunately,
unleashed in Iraq. The
Unfortunately,
sectarian
these
violence
things,
that didn't exist
do matter
before,
once again
the
today,
creation of ISIS that is
for all
now
the reasons that
spread
people
way
have outlined
beyond
in the first
Iraq,
session. We are
and
now
is a
facing a situation in
justification
which,
for continued
despite
U.S. and
everything that
NATO
has happened,
intervention around
the
the
US and
world.
Britain are spearheading
After
what
the
looks
20th anniversary in
remarkably
Afghanistan
and dangerously
and the
like a new
pullout
drive
of
to
U.S.
war,
NATO
this time
troops,
against
the
China,
world
a
can
nuclear
now
armed
see
power
the
with an
disaster that
enormous
has
military.
been.
So
And we
we're going
see
to
the 20
need,
years
I
and a
believe,
return of the
a new global
Taliban
movement
and
against
trillions
that
of
almost
dollars
unthinkable
spent
threat.
and countless
And I think that
lives
work
of
needs to start
Afghans
today.
lost, as well as thousands.
So, thank you. We've got a great panel. I'm going to start, actually, or we're going to start, hopefully, if the technicals work, with a message from someone who was very centrally involved in the global anti-war movement for the United States. Some of you will know her name. It's Medea Benjamin, who is now an organizer from Code Pink, but has been absolutely central to building this massive anti-war movement around the world. So here it is, Medea Benjamin.
And I'm with a peace group called Code Pink in the United States. And it's a great honor for me to address the Stop the War Coalition, Action, our wonderful ally over this last 20 years. I'll never forget when we were together at the World Social Forum and Chris Nineham and others from the Stop the War Coalition said, why don't we have a global day of action to protest the upcoming threat of war in Iraq? And there was a roar from the crowd, and we said, yes, let's do it. And indeed, there was that February 15th, 2003 day that the world said no to war. And while we weren't able to stop the war, we certainly reflected the global sentiment against going into war, and we've continued to do that for the last 20 years, to point out the lies, the destruction, the horrors of these 20 years of response to the 9/11 attacks. In the case of Afghanistan, it was easy to convince people to go to war because, at least in the US, there was a thirst for revenge. But when it came to Iraq, it was harder. And that's why our governments, including Tony Blair in the UK, had to lie to the people, telling us that there were weapons of mass destruction when there weren't, telling us that there were ties between Saddam Hussein and Al-Qaeda when there weren't. And I remember going to Iraq with a group of women from the United States before the US began the bombing, and women telling us, please, we do not like Saddam Hussein, but we don't want you to liberate us with your bombs. And we see how that, quote, liberation has been so disastrous for the people of Iraq. Our friends there are either dead, maimed, dispersed around the world, and we here in the United States barely even talk about all of the violence that we unleashed in Iraq, the sectarian violence that didn't exist before, the creation of ISIS that is now spread way beyond Iraq and is a justification for continued US and NATO intervention around the world. After the 20th anniversary in Afghanistan and the pullout of US NATO troops, the world can now see the disaster that that has been. And we see that 20 years and a return of the Taliban and trillions of dollars spent and countless lives of Afghans lost, as well as thousands of our own soldiers, has only fed this war machine that continues to be hungry for the next war. And that's why it's so important that we come together across the Atlantic, the UK and the US particularly, to stop the next war, which they are aiming for, which is a war on China. Most recently, we see how the US and the UK have convinced the Australians not to work with France, but with our countries and our companies to produce these nuclear-powered submarines that is only fueling the tension in the South China Seas and fueling a conflict with China. It's interesting how it was France early on, before going into the war in Iraq, that warned us and said, this is not a good idea. And now we see France being pushed out and the war hawk countries of the US and the UK fueling this new conflict. So once again, we have so much work to do to get our countries out of the Middle East, to stop a new war from China, with China, and also to stop our countries from selling or, quote, giving weapons to the most repressive countries around the world, including Israel, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, and the United Arab Emirates. So I look forward to continuing to work with you at the Stop the War Coalition so that we can change our government's foreign policies, we can stop the madness of fueling this war machine, and we can get on track to have our countries focusing on diplomacy, on the real threats to our world, which is the climate crisis and the pandemic we now face, and global poverty and global racism, and stop fueling hatred, war, and militarism. Stop the war. Let's do it.
So we'll send your best wishes and thanks to Medea Benjamin. I'd now like to introduce Kate Hudson, who is, as many of you will know, the General Secretary of CND, but also ever since the time when she took that office, or whichever the previous office was that she had in 2003, she's been absolutely central to the anti-war movement and played an absolutely vital role. So over to you, Kate.
Thanks very much indeed, Chris. And can I just start off by congratulating Lindsey, Stop the War Coalition, everyone who's been involved in the anti-war movement for 2 decades of incredibly hard but incredibly principled work. And CND is proud to have been alongside you for those 2 decades, and we'll carry on until the journey's won. So, yesterday I was talking with a young student. She's writing her dissertation about Iraq and the anti-war movement. And we were talking about the big demonstrations and how CND worked alongside Stop the War and the Muslim Association of Britain. We talked about how it felt to be involved in such a mass event. And then she said to me, why did the British people care so much about Iraq that they did all this? And of course, that's a great question because, of course, no one much in Britain knew about Iraq, its history, Britain's involvement in Iraq, or even, for many people, where Iraq actually was. So I think that to answer this question is really to explain the remarkable nature of Stop the War and what it achieved then and continues to achieve. Because questions of war and peace do have huge mobilizing power. Think of the scale of the anti-cruise demonstrations in the 1980s, when we all thought that we would die in a nuclear war. Hundreds of thousands of us mobilized because it was literally a matter of life and death to us. But what was so extraordinary about the anti-war demonstrations 20 years ago was that they were not actually about a risk to us here in Britain at all. They were against a war in a far-off, unknown country. Yet many, many times more people protested against that war than turned out in the 1980s to protect their own country, their own families against that very real danger of nuclear annihilation. What an incredible achievement. And I think that the greatest achievement of the Stop the War Coalition was to have the political understanding, the vision and the commitment to build that movement and that mobilization. Yeah, to stop the war. And they provided an inclusive framework which embraced the breadth of the people protesting, very diverse communities, diverse issues from across our society. They articulated the moral outrage of those communities. They spearheaded the opposition to the criminal lies that led to the war. And they facilitated the protest of millions against the horrors of war, the injustices and the barbarity that followed, and of course, which continue to this day. But of course, it wasn't just the big demonstrations in London. The creativity of the movement was just amazing across the entire country, across all ages and all walks of life, using pretty much every single form of non-violent protest that can be imagined. And those of you around and involved at the time will remember that music and art were at the heart of those protests. And perhaps my strongest visual memory of it was when George Bush came to town in November 2003. Remember the outrage? And we had a huge demonstration. And Theatre of War, an activist group from East Anglia, they built a massive statue of Bush out of gold papier-mâché. And we pulled it down from the plinth in Trafalgar Square. I mean, what an amazing experience. And amongst other things, we also had a peace camp in Trafalgar Square in March 2005. Many people brought their tents, there were marquees, there were events going on, talks, but many of us slept there for some nights. And Catherine Hamlet, the great fashion designer, produced a series of fabulous T-shirts, and I'm proud to wear one today in tribute to her great work. The global anti-war movement, Chris touched on this, but quoting a slightly different terminology, I remember the global anti-war movement being described as the second superpower, not just public opinion. And of course, international solidarity and cooperation was fundamental to its success. This was never just something based in Britain against Blair. This was an international movement. And from the European Social Forum in Florence, which, as Chris mentioned, called the Day of Action in February 2003. From there onwards, many demonstrations across the world and much solidarity and interchange between the different movements. And of course, our work with the movement in the US was of crucial importance. The military families and veterans here and in the United States linking up, Medea and others, very active, a real mass movement in the US. So it's important to reflect on those times, not just because there are many positive memories, but because there are lessons to be learned about the essential principles of unity, inclusivity, and internationalism in our fight against imperialism and war. Because we are not just a movement with a remarkable past, we are a movement of critical importance for today and for all our futures. The US has been defeated in Afghanistan, but it is on its way to its next war. And the news, of course, this week that others have mentioned about the AUKUS Pact, it's dangerous in the extreme. It's a massive escalation of the Cold War on China, which may lead to a hot war. And we in the anti-war movement have to understand the scale of what is taking place, the strategic shift, and our government's malign role in it. But I have no doubt that Stop the War will step up to the plate, that together with CND, the Muslim communities, and beyond, we will reinvigorate and expand the movement, and together we will build the alliances here and internationally that will enable us once again to take on the warmongers and to win. Solidarity.
Thanks very much, Kate. I'm now very pleased to welcome to the podium Haifa Zangana, who has been actually a supporter and an active participant in the anti-war movement since right back in the day of 2003. She's an Iraqi writer, a painter, and also a political activist, and she's going to say a few words and read a poem. Over to you, Haifa.
Right, thank you so much for inviting me. Thank you. I never felt over the years, the last 20 years, that I am supporting the Stop the War. I was part of Stop the War. I felt that all the time. And probably that what helped us or gave us a tool whenever we've seen what's happened in Iraq in the last 18 years, where the occupation shot democracy in the head, that we can say there are British people who are different, and British people who believe in Iraqi rights and ruling themselves in independence and building democracy as it should be, not according to governments. So, I wrote this short poem, and Iraqis are very famous for their poetry. They think it's their own language. So anyway, it might not be up to the Iraqi poetry, but here it is. I wrote it immediately after listening to the result of the Chilcot inquiry in 2016. And I call it 2.6 million hearts. Wars don't have holidays. Employers claim they are self-employed. Their job has to be fulfilled at any cost, at all times, not to leave behind green orchards, fertile land, or blue sky. Some argue wars are sensitive to light. Wars don't read reports. They are far too busy. devouring lives. Wars don't read inquiries of 2.6 million words. Unlike Chilcot, their mission would not be accomplished until death swallows 2.6 million hearts, or preferably more. After all, we have been warned time after time. In the beginning, war was the war. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much for that moving poem, Haifa. One of the things that was powerful and inspirational about the movement in the end of 2002 and 2003 was that school students started to get involved in an organised way. I don't know if there's any of you here who were involved at the time. I'm hoping there are, but we certainly have one on the platform. And in fact, after the big demo on February the 15th, there was a big school students movement, probably the biggest school students movement in British history, that led to massive strikes on the day that the war actually started, and caused mayhem, not just in London, but in many other cities around the country. Kate Connelly here was one of the organisers of School Students Against the War. Give her a big round of applause.
Thank you so much to everyone who organised this really important event here today, and thank you very much for inviting me to speak on this platform. It's a real privilege to speak with the speakers here today. What I want to start off by saying is that before the 2003 school strikes, my generation was demonised as apathetic, and this was a truism that was repeated by the politicians in the media. In my AS level politics class, we were asked to ruminate constantly on why it was that my generation was so politically apathetic. But with the beginning of the war on terror, young people like myself got involved with our local Stop the War coalition groups. We helped out on stalls on Saturdays. We joined the demonstrations. And then in 2003, we organised 2 massive nationwide school strikes in an attempt to stop the impending war on Iraq. And that involved us organising picket lines outside our schools and colleges, arguing with our friends about why they should join us out on strike. We brought city centres to a standstill. In London, school students climbed the gates of Downing Street. We were dragged off the roads right outside Parliament, but on the streets of many, many cities up and down the UK, facing in most places actually quite a high level of police violence and arrests. And what we showed, I think, was that what they mistook for apathy was our contempt for a corrupt and bankrupt and cynical, there is no alternative kind of politics. A kind of politics that found its most grotesque expression in the war on Iraq. And what we did alongside everybody else in Stop the War was to demand a different kind of politics, a politics that was based on solidarity and internationalism. And my generation was the last generation to be demonized, a young generation to be demonized as apathetic. After 2003, what we saw was a wave of occupations in the colleges against universities with deals with armed companies in protest at the occupation of Palestine. We saw huge student demonstrations against top-up fees. We saw international demonstrations for women's rights and girls' rights when students walked out of schools in the slut walk movement internationally. We saw the climate strike movement. We saw Black Lives Matter and school students and young people demanding that they should have a say in what they were taught in schools. And I think they, very much like us, understood that there is and always has been an alternative. Now, in 2003, as people have mentioned, we didn't stop the war. And I think there are two conclusions that can be drawn from that. One conclusion, the conclusion that I think Tony Blair and his heirs would like us to draw, is that essentially we are powerless and we are unable to change things. But the other conclusion that we could draw was that then and now we needed a stronger and not a weaker anti-war movement, that we needed more, not fewer demonstrations, and that we need to involve larger and larger numbers of people in organising together in a movement against war. And I think when we look round at what's happening in the world today, the urgency of that is proved ever more starkly. And indeed, that has been the only way that so-called ordinary people have ever changed anything anyway. I very much look forward to helping build that movement with you. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Kate. That brought back a lot of memories of those crazy days in the run-up to the war. Sami Ramadani was going to be with us today. Unfortunately, he can't be because he has some health issues in his family. So I've asked Alex Kenny, who's an officer of Stop the War and also on the executive of the National Education Union, to read out a message from Sami. Sami Ramadani is a central figure in the anti-war movement, was crucial in the movement against the Iraq war. He was one of the organisers of a group called Iraqi Democrats Against War and Occupation, and he really has played a very important role over the last 2 decades. So it's a real shame that he's not here today, but I'll ask Alex now to read out his message. Over to you, Alex.
Thanks, Chris. Yeah, very much the understudy to Sami, who would have expanded on what I'm going to read out. But just wait till I tell my sister I've appeared on the same stage as Mark Rylance. I'm going to be dining out on that. And if you haven't got a ticket for Jerusalem next year, beg, borrow, or steal one. Just before I read out Sami's words, it gives me an opportunity on behalf of the National Education Union to say thank you to Stop the War and to say that how proud I am of our relationship with Stop the War over the years, because we see the effects of war in our schools with refugee children, and let me tell you, students in school want to talk about these things. You know, the collapse of the government in Afghanistan has provoked lots of discussion going on in schools, and we'll make sure those discussions do go on. And I do want to thank Chris, Andrew, Lindsey, Shelly, and all the Stop the War officers. They're a great bunch to work with, and it's been a really educative experience for me working with them and being in conversations with them. And I want to thank the people in the background, in the office, Maya, Tarina, Grace Sweater, Shabbir, and all the people that have gone before them, because they put in the legwork that make our demonstrations what they are. So we all remember where we were on February the 15th, 2003, don't we? I wasn't in London. I've never told anyone this before. I wasn't on the demo. I was taking a group of sixth form students. Actually, on that day, we were in the Winter Palace in St. Petersburg, formerly Leningrad. And I watched it on TV in Russia. So, you know, I was with you. And let me tell you about this. Hundreds of students from Tower Hamlets came out of school on that day the war started. They stole our NUT banners. It was the NUT at the time. And they decided they were going to go to Whitehall. And we tried to keep up with them, but they were younger. And this is the day before smartphones and Google, and they didn't know where they were going. They didn't, you know, we heard stories of them stopping the police or going into shops and offices saying, do you know where Parliament is? And eventually they did get there. You know, these are kids who don't go out of Tower Hamlets very often, but they did get there, and we were really proud of what they did on that day. So without further ado, if I can unlock my phone, I want to read you Sami's words, and it is a real shame he wouldn't be here because he's been a real, you know, stalwart of the movement and able to give an insight into what Iraqi people were going through and what they were thinking about it. So he says, comrades and friends, apologies for not being able to be with you today. If terrorism is defined as killing civilians for political ends, then the past 20 years have witnessed the biggest and most lethal and destructive terrorist wars post-World War II and the wars on Korea and Vietnam. Nearly 2 million people have been killed in Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya, Syria, Palestine, and Yemen by the world's leading military power and its sidekicks in Britain, Australia, and others. These military and economic genocidal wars, waged in the name of fighting terrorism, have actually utilized the very terrorist gangs that the US and UK are allegedly fighting. Stop the War has played the leading role in opposing and alerting the public against these wars of aggression. But US-led imperialism is planning even more wars against Iran, Lebanon, Palestine, and now China and Russia. As ever, these threats of war are designed to further empower the giant imperialist corporations and line the pockets of multi-billionaires. I have no doubt Stop the War will redouble its efforts and energetically campaign against these wars and threats to world peace. Let's all unite and actively campaign to stop the slide into the abyss of new imperialist wars. In solidarity, Sami Ramadani. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Alex, and we will obviously send regards to Sami. There have been a whole number of groups that have been, and individuals and networks and organisations that have played an absolutely central role in the campaigns. And we're going to be hearing from more of them this afternoon. But there's one other organisation that I just want to, one group of people that I want to honour really now, which is that during the campaign against the Iraq war, we found some members of families that had soldiers in Iraq, and actually later on some soldiers themselves coming forward to say they opposed the war. Many of them were people who lost sons and daughters in the war. Now, this was an incredibly brave thing to do. It involved, you know, not just confronting the media and the politicians, but also the whole military establishment. But it was also an incredibly powerful part of the movement. We had, I think we had as many as 50 military families involved in the campaign at its peak, and I think it played they played a very important role in delegitimising the war in this country. And I'm very, very pleased that we have with us Peter Brierley, who was one of the founders of the organisation that we worked with, Military Families Against the War. He lost his son in Iraq, his son Sean, in Iraq in 2003, very, very soon after the invasion. He was and is a tireless activist, but also he has one other important claim to fame, which is that he snubbed Tony Blair in St Paul's at the ceremony. At the ceremony where Blair was crying crocodile tears for those that had lost their lives in Iraq. You're a very brave man, Peter. Over to you.
Thank you for this. Before I start, there is a little bit more to that story. I refused to shake his hand and told him what I thought of him. And leading up to that, I'd been to several Stop the War meetings about the Chilcot inquiry And one of the things that kept coming up was, Tony Blair is going to be EU president, and how can we stop him? And the only way anybody could think of was to assassinate him. And that just wasn't an option. After I'd refused to shake his hand, he actually, I got a phone call about a fortnight later, and it was a journalist who said, it's just a courtesy call to let you know this article's going in paper. And Macron in France, Angela Merkel were supporting Blair's presidency because of what I did and something that happened later the week after somebody threw a shoe at him. Because of that, if that we can't have a president, well, that's going to happen to. So for that action, Tony Blair didn't become EU president. Right, as Chris says, I'm Peter Brierley. I lost my son Sean in Iraq. Like this gentleman here, I watched that march in February with fingers crossed because I knew that the chances are that my son would be going. I found out about a fortnight. He didn't tell us that he was actually there the day before that march started. So they were already there before he had that march. But on the 30th of March, we got the knock on the door. Sean had been killed, and you don't know what to do. You know, I'm an ordinary bloke, and for maybe 2 years, I would go get invited to local Stop the War meetings and local press. Then one day I got a phone call from Andrew Bergin, who said, we're starting this movement. We've already had Rose Gentle, I've forgotten his name, Reg Keys. These were people who were, and we're starting this, we want to get together and we want to get a court case to try and get the government to court, Tony Blair to court. And we went on over several years, really. We went backwards and forwards. Without Stop the War, we couldn't have done that because none of us individually knew anything about it. And when you talk about it being an international thing, I personally have spoken in France. I led a march against the American embassy in Sweden, and other members have gone. We've been to Japan, we've been to America. I was invited to America, but I couldn't go because I had to work. Well, without the Stop the War, it would not have been possible. We would not have been able to do that. They organised press conferences for us. They organised a solicitor and the barrister to go to court. They paid for us to come to meetings. And one of the things I've often said is, I was an armchair activist. I used to look and see you people marching and think, I'd love to do that. And never got out of my chair. Once I got involved with it, once Chris got us involved with this, I've been on loads of marches, and really enjoyed it. It's really good. And one of the things that, when I look around today, you're celebrating 20 years, and when I look around today, the same people who were there in 2003 when I first got involved, a lot of the people are still here. And not only are they still here, they're still as enthusiastic about what they do. So that, it can go on forever. And then you look around again and you see this young lady here, young people. So Chris is knocking on a bit, so he'll probably have to retire. Lindsey will be able to go on, but it's safe enough to say that it'll be in good hands because there's a lot of young people about. And I won't take too much more of your time, but I just want to tell you a little story about Chris, and he probably doesn't remember. I was invited to speak at a meeting in Halifax, near where I live, and Chris were there, and he said, we're having a demonstration. It was 3 weeks' time, and there's been a rule put in that we can't demonstrate in front of Parliament. They're trying to stop you. So what we want to do is get a few people. There's a imam involved. There's somebody else, and he told me 5 or 6 people are involved. So, come the day, I came down, and whenever we got a new person joined us, there were always a petition or something. So we all went on to Downing Street and did the petition, and we were coming back, and the lady who just started said, unfortunately, I need a drink. I need to have a drink before we can go on this march. So Andrew Bergen, we're going to this cafe. So we're going across the road. He said, where are you going? So I'm going to the cafe with you for a coffee. He said, no, you're not. Get yourself back down there. You've got this thing, you've got to say something in front of Parliament, before we set off, because they're not going to stop it. Well, fair enough. So I went back. They handed me a megaphone. My son died for democracy in another country. You're not going to stop me marching here. Turned round with a megaphone. There was nobody else there. In front of me, there's loads of people clicking the cameras and things. So we set off marching, and I just happened to say to Chris, I don't know what happened. Where everybody? So I said, what about police? So we're not allowed to do it. Don't worry, Peter. You don't have no to worry about. Why? They're not going to arrest you in front of all them thousands of people. As soon as you're on I dare come to London anymore because I'm scared of police. And that was Chris's fault. But as I've just said, because of the young people who are here already, the people who are already involved in it are still as involved now as they were 20 years. I think my personal hope would be that tomorrow you don't need it anymore. Well, that ain't going to happen. So I'm quite happy that it's in good hands. The people who are sat here, as I say, the old ones Chris will retire eventually. But there are a lot of young people I've met, because, like I say, there's a lot of people that seem to have been there for 20 years and are still as enthusiastic about it. So thank you very much for listening to me. And thank you.
Few. I think he's got worse stories than that, actually. But anyway, thanks very much, Peter. Thanks to all of the panelists. We now have, I think, are we going to have a full 20-minute break? We're running a little bit late, but I think we can have a 20-minute break till 4 o'clock. And in the break, do come back. Bang on 4 o'clock, though, because we're up against time, and that's the session on Islamophobia and civil liberties. And during the break, we are showing a little clip from Amir Amirani's film, We Are Many, and we're also taking a collection at the door. So see you in 20 minutes, people.
Take our girls, time to go home. Don't take our boys away, no. Don't take our girls away, no. Don't take our boys away, no. Those who build walls are pretending that forever they can defend them. No, 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 no. No, 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 no. And those who dam streams can build fountains. Yes, they can. Yes, they can. But those of us who just let them run free, we can move mountains. What I know, they never gonna tell you I know. They only wanna tell you lies, no. Never ever gonna tell you I know. They only wanna tell you lies, no. Never ever gonna tell you I know. They only wanna tell you lies. It's time to go home. Don't take our boys away, no. Don't take our girls away, no. Don't take our boys away, no. Don't take our girls. It's time to go home. Don't take our boys away, no. Don't take our girls away, no. Don't take our boys away, no. How many people were they running from it? How many people never saw it coming? How many people never heard the warning? How many people never stayed at home? How many people never heard the calling? How many people never saw it all? How many people did they spend it on? And how many people got to sing the song? And how many people never heard the crying? How many people gotten pushed aside? And how many people never saw the doves fly? How many people never said goodbye? And how many people never saw the fall? And how many people till we ended all? And how many people never saw the wrong? And how many people did they drop the bomb on? Don't take our boys away, no. Don't take our girls away, no. Don't take our boys away, no. Don't take our girls away, no. Don't take our boys away, no. Don't take our girls away, no. Don't take our boys away. It's time to go home. Away, away, highway right. Away, no, away, 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 away. Don't take our boys away.
Say no matter what color, now, you're still my brother. Everybody wants to live together. Why can't we live together? Everybody wants to live together. Why can't we live together?
We those who start wars never fight them. And those who fight wars, they never like them. And those who write laws, they can recite them. And those of us who just fight laws, we live and die them. But I know they're never gonna tell you why, no. They only wanna tell you lies, no. Never ever gonna tell you why, no. They only wanna tell you lies, no. Never ever gonna tell you why, no. They only wanna tell you lies. It's time. It's time to go home. Don't take our boys away, no. Don't take our girls away, no. Don't take our boys away, no. Don't take our girls. It's time to go home. Don't take our boys away, no. Don't take our girls away, no. Don't take our boys away, no. Those who build walls are pretending that forever they can defend them. No, 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 no. No, 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 no. And those who dam streams can build fountains. Yes, they can. Yes, they can. But those of us who just let them run free, we can move mountains. But I know they're never gonna tell you why, no. They only wanna tell you lies, no. Never ever gonna tell you why, no. They only wanna tell you lies, no. Never ever gonna tell you why, no. They only wanna tell you lies. It's time. It's time to go home. Don't take our boys away, no. Don't take our girls away, no. Don't take our boys away, no. Don't take our girls. It's time to go home. Don't take our boys away, no. Don't take our girls away, no. Don't take our boys away, no. How many people were they running from it? How many people never saw it coming? those who start wars never fight them. And those who fight wars, they never like them. And those who write laws, they can recite them. And those of us who just fight laws, we live and die them. But I know they're never gonna tell you why, no. They only wanna tell you lies, no. Never ever gonna tell you why, no. They only wanna tell you lies, no. Never ever gonna tell you why, no. They only wanna tell you lies. It's time. It's time to go home. Don't take our boys away, no. Don't take our girls away, no. Don't take our boys away, no. Don't take our girls. It's time to go home. Don't take our boys away, no. Don't take our girls away, no. Don't take our boys away, no. Those who build walls are pretending that forever they can defend them. No, 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 no. No, 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 no. And those who dam streams can build fountains. Yes, they can. Yes, they can. But those of us who just let them run free, we can move mountains. But I know they're never gonna tell you why, no. They only wanna tell you lies, no. Never ever gonna tell you why, no. They only wanna tell you lies, no. Never ever gonna tell you why, no. They only wanna tell you lies. It's time. It's time to go home. Don't take our boys away, no. Don't take our girls away, no. Don't take our boys away, no. Don't take our girls. It's time to go home. Don't take our boys away, no. Don't take our girls away, no. Don't take our boys away, no. Flush it. How many people were they running from it? How many people never saw it coming?
And when the next day, the New York Times on the front page above the fold said this great truth, once again there were two superheroes in the United States.
Good afternoon, everybody. Can I commence this next session on Islamophobia and civil liberties? If you don't know me already, I was the previous chair of Stop the War Coalition, Murad Qureshi. We've got 4 speakers on Islamophobia and civil liberties. Now, those of us who were there at that first founding meeting in Friend's house will know that 2 issues came off the floor very clearly. It wasn't just stop the war actions in Afghanistan and subsequently Iraq. People were naturally very concerned about Islamophobia, targeted obviously at Muslims, as well as a deterioration in our civil liberties. So it's right and proper we have a session covering those areas and where we've got to over the last 20 years. Now, thankfully, our first speaker was there that fateful day in Friend's house as one of the founding members of Stop the War Coalition, John Rees, and he's going to lead on civil liberties and where we've got to over the last 20 years. Thank you, John.
Could make a difference because
yes, Murad's absolutely right. At the founding moment of the Stop the War Coalition, we realised, I think everybody in the room realised, that an inevitable consequence of the drive to war would be a racist backlash specifically directed at the Muslim community and a renewed attack on civil liberties. Because if you are going to take a country unwillingly to war, if you're going to take a country to war where the majority of the population disagrees with that war, actively disagrees with that war, then you are going to have to silence their voices and try and prevent them from protesting effectively on the streets. And that is exactly what's happened since the war on terror. A renewed assault on the Muslim community, the birth of Islamophobia on a society-wide scale, and a renewed attack on civil liberties. Now, I want to talk about one particular case of civil liberties, and that's the case of Julian Assange. Because if there is one voice more than any other who brought forth the truth about the war in Afghanistan and the occupation of Iraq, brought it forth on a globally important scale, it was the work that Julian Assange did through WikiLeaks. I was there at the first press conference in the Frontline Club when those war logs were released. It was a bombshell, not because we did not know what was going on, but because it had not been proved in such unrelenting detail as it was through those WikiLeaks releases. Now, we know what's happened to Julian Assange since. He has been persecuted by the United States, imprisoned by the British government, and silenced as a critic of war and of corporate misgovernance. Now, I think that in this movement, we have to learn something from the American Marines and from the Army Rangers of the United States. Because they have a slogan, which is, "We never leave a fallen comrade on the battlefield." Well, we are not going to leave Julian Assange imprisoned in Belmarsh. It was, in fact, in this very hall and on this very stage that the Stop the War Coalition held one of the first of the rallies to support Julian Assange when he was forced into the Ecuadorian embassy. It was here that Jen Robinson, his lawyer, together with Tony Benn, Tariq Ali, Lindsey German, spoke up at the very first attempt to silence Julian Assange. And we won't stop. We haven't stopped. We're not going to stop now. It will be 2 years. 2 years. Think about this. 2 years next week that Julian Assange will have spent in Belmarsh prison on remand. I'll tell you what on remand means. It means innocent. It means not charged and not convicted of any crime. Now, there is a principle, and it's a long-standing and valuable principle in British law. It's called habeas corpus. It means that you cannot hold a body in prison without bringing them before a court and charging them of a crime, and if you can't do that, you should let them go. There is virtually no prisoner in the British prison system that's been held without charge or trial for 2 years. And I say now to Priti Patel and the rest of them, let this man go. What you are doing is illegal. What you're doing is immoral. What you're doing is inhuman. And he must be set free. Now, Julian Assange has actually won one trial. The decision of the Westminster Magistrates' Court at the very beginning of this year was that he would be a suicide risk if he were sent into the American prison system. He would be at risk of his life if he were sent to a supermax jail in the United States. That should have been the end of it. When that judge handed down that judgment, he should have walked out of the prison in Belmarsh. When I told David Davis, the Tory MP, of that result, he said, well, why on earth isn't he free and walking the streets? It's a damn good question, and the British government and the American government don't have a damn good answer to it. So from everything we've learned about building the Stop the War Coalition, from everything we've learned about public campaigning, I urge you to follow Peter Brierley's advice. He had it exactly right in the last session about what the Stop the War Coalition does. It brings people together and organizes them so that they can do things and achieve things that they could never hope to do separately. We don't have wealth. We don't have power. We aren't a great corporation. We aren't a government machine. But we are collectively far stronger than we are individually, and we can enable things to be done and for people to achieve things that they could never do separately. I've said it many times, I'll say it again here. Every great mass movement is a mosaic of small acts. So before you leave today, go over to the stall there, pick up the leaflets for the demonstrations that are coming up outside the Court of Appeal, where the United States are hoping to overturn the decision of the Westminster Court and drag Julian Assange to the United States to put him on trial for espionage when what he was really doing was journalism. Let's be clear, journalism. So go over to the stall. If it's the only thing you do in the next week, pick up the leaflet for the national demonstration on Saturday the 27th of October, pick up the leaflet for the demonstration outside the court on the 27th of October, and even if you only take a few, take them to your family, to your friends, to the people in your workplace or your church or your mosque, and give them to them and say, come on. If only 2 of us go, it will be better than 1 of us going. If you can do more than that and get a resolution adopted in your organization or your trade union, if you can bring a coach load, good. If you can bring 2 coach loads, better. But bring yourself, bring a friend, bring somebody from your family or your work or your trade union or your church or your mosque, because this is how the great and the powerful are prevented from holding down the poor and the weak. This is how information gets out rather than information being suppressed. This is how the truth is heard rather than lies circulating the globe. It's up to you. It's up to us. Take this into your own hands and make sure that the United States government Don't keep this man in jail because he is one of us, one of ours, and we need him out and free.
Thank you, John. Well, thank you, John, for that rousing speech and giving us where we are with civil liberties and where we are with Julian Assange. The only thing I managed to contribute in my time at the London Assembly was closing down Paddington Green Police Station's anti-terrorist unit where they used to keep IRA suspect. I'm only sorry, though, they moved it all to Belmarsh. The next speaker will be talking on Islamophobia, and he's been a leading light on anti-racism in this country for many, many years. He's a co-convener of Anti-Racism Day and a joint secretary of Unite Against Fascism. Weyman Bennett, sorry.
I also bring greetings from Stand Up to Racism. And I want to say this clearly, that when we talk about the war, we should be clear that one of the first things that happened with the growth of Islamophobia and racism, they used racism to divide us. And we have to hold people responsible for what happened. I've just came from a speech from Digby Mosque, a mosque that was firebombed last week. And we have to be clear, when they talk about terrorism and racism, it grew out of the way that they conducted that war. And what's most disgusting is that the consequences of those wars we see today. You know what they're called? They're called refugees. And I want to we should send a message from this hall to Priti Patel to say, stop bombing and welcome the refugees. Refugees are welcome here. You can't spend money on killing people and bombing them and then saying to them, why are you running from our bombs? Why are you running from the people that we put in those controls? So when we talk about civil liberties, we should be clear. The other consequence of it was the increase of Islamophobia and racism used to divide. I've always said this, and we've always said this. When you see the rise of a new racism, what it means is that other racisms will rise. Racism against black people, anti-Semitism will rise as a consequence of making it acceptable. That's what happened as a consequence of the war. I remember the first meeting, actually, with Jeremy Corbyn. I was a teacher at the beginning of the war, and I was so glad to hear because the most active people were young people who walked out of our college at the beginning of the war and said that they should oppose it. And one of the things that we were all concerned about was the way that the government was changing the laws in order to stop people. If you're black, you're 9 times more likely to stop. But under the Securities Act of 2015, what you've seen is a situation where they can stop you and don't give you a reason. They've used the rise of prevent to lead to a loss of liberties and rights. You have children being questioned under channel inside schools illegally by being mistreated. That's a consequence of the war. Racism is used to divide and rule. That's always been its role. That's always been its consequence. And I want to say this part of what I was going to say. What was the consequence of the war? Do you remember the EDL? Without the war in Iraq, without that, the question of Stephen Yoxley and the EDL would have been some idiot inside Luton making racist comments to his telly. What they gave them, the government, the rest of them gave them the oxygen and the confidence to take to our streets, to attack our mosque, to give a level of racism that we'd not seen in our society for a very long time. But I'm pleased to say one thing. We smashed the BNP, we smashed the EDL, and we did it by saying we will not allow them to attack any member of our community. They will not attack one mosque. That every time they marched, we came out together, and we made sure that we stopped them. And that's the reason why it doesn't exist today. And I don't believe that you would have had the rise of the impact of securitization of the world. That's part of the reason why you had the Black Lives Matter movement. I remember going to Ferguson after the first movement and you saw armed troops fresh with weapons from Afghanistan and Iraq on the streets of America. Where did they get the confidence and the training to do that? That was a consequence of racism. That's a consequence of war. It fed into racism and division. And we have to remember this as a question about how we fight in the future. because I think we have to fight the Nationalities and Borders Act. Why is it all right to bomb Afghanistan but not let people come in from Afghanistan? How can you actually say that? How can you talk about getting a boat and pushing children back into the sea? We know what that means. It means they'll drown. And that's what our government said. That's why we should demonstrate outside the Tory, when the People's Assembly demonstration is called, Stamp to Rest called a demonstration against Priti Patel, we should demonstrate for the right of refugees to come here. We should say they're welcome here. We should join those demonstrations and we should participate in them. So, I want to just, it's my final point, yeah? There's a man called Zangana. He was an imam in South London, and he's my friend. And he was one of the people that was speaking out for Shaka Amma, who was a prisoner in Guantanamo. And that's when they remove all rights of people. And I think one of the things we should campaign about, it's not enough. There's still people, they say, still locked up in Guantanamo. But somebody should be held responsible for that. It's not all right to tell us that you believe in civilized values, British laws, empire, and then look how they treat people. We have to make sure that all those people that removed people's basic rights, we have to demand that they were put back and they're held accountable. We have to make sure all those people that in this government that are responsible for it, that those people get justice. So I'll end up with that. No justice. No justice! No justice!
Thank you, Weyman, for your contribution. And also, thankfully, sticking on time as well. Just to make an announcement, John announced that there are leaflets to how you can help out in Julian Assange's campaign. There's also something for you to read as well, a new leaflet by Lindsey and Andrew, We Are Many, the story of the movement for the last 20 years. On your way out, you'll be able to get a copy of the publication, and obviously it's been released for this particular event today. Our next speaker is a patron of Stop the War Coalition. She's passionate about social justice and mental health, a proud NHS worker, mother, and a Bromie.
Thank you. It really has been 20 years. I get called patron and things like that. When I saw the invite to this event, I have to be honest, I had a real mix of emotions. Huge sense of pride at how so many of us came together. We did something good. A huge sense of sadness that so many people are not with us who would have been with us had these terrible wars not been started. And I want to give my condolences to Peter. I was so moved to hear your contribution. For so many people, these are political, ideological, intellectual fights. But the realities of these brutal wars is that people lose their loved ones. People are tortured. People are forced to flee their homes, the places and the neighborhoods that they love. There are underground cells, which we may never see, unlike the cages that are now being revealed in Afghanistan, where the screams were never heard, but they occurred. And I have to say that these things have given me nightmares over these last 20 years. 20 years ago, I was a young mum of 2. Now I have 5 boys, lots of grown-up young men around me. But I'm sad for them, that they grew up in a world after 9/11 where they never knew what it was like to be a Muslim and not be automatically associated with terrorism. To not know a world where wars were seen as inevitable. To now be growing up in a world where climate change is threatening the very future of the planet. So actually, I thought it was difficult what we went through 20 years ago. But one thing we did have then was freedom of speech. The only thing that was stopping us here in the UK from speaking up, from organising, getting together in numbers that resulted in that fantastic 2 million march in 2003, 200 coaches from Birmingham alone, woohoo! But today, in a way, I think as a result of the very successes of our great movement, the establishment has moved. We predicted the attacks on civil liberties, but you can never know exactly how they're going to do what they do. But today we stand at a time when Julian Assange has been left to rot for 2 years in Belmarsh, a high-security prison. His crime being what? He didn't do the torturing. He didn't even mandate the torturing. He didn't unleash bombs on innocent people. He hasn't caused the deaths of 30,000 US soldiers, 683 British soldiers. The suicides of those, in fact, who've come back, the ones who were sent to fight, are actually far greater than the ones who were even killed in action. He was not responsible for that. Those people like Tony Blair and Alistair Campbell and the Tory senior politicians who cheered them on, who are still free to roam the studios and are given season tickets to, Newsnight and you name it, all the respectable mainstream media, those people are free and still fated by our establishment. And Julian Assange's only crime was that he revealed the truth of the whistleblower Manning, Chelsea Manning. A young soldier in America decided that they couldn't look the other way. And the kind of things that we tell our kids to do, speak the truth, don't look the other way, speak up for justice, don't allow the bullies to get away with it. We've got all these campaigns, government-endorsed campaigns, haven't we, anti-bullying? And that's what Chelsea Manning did, this young soldier, decided to tell the truth and let people know. So the crime was letting people know the horror of what was going on in their name, using their hard-earned tax money. And that's your money, my money from the UK, in America. Money that could be used to actually build a safe and sustainable health service where people don't have to rely on food banks in this country, where our pensioners don't have to choose between heating and eating. So actually it comes right back here, the things that we send out there. And that's what also I was reflecting on, how it's terrible when the figures are just too enormous to even comprehend. 2 million killed directly as a result of the bombs. 40 million refugees as a result of the war on terror. $2 trillion, talking about $32 million every single hour, every single day of the last 20 years spent on war. It doesn't take a genius to work out how the world could have been a much better place today had we invested that in something different. But the other casualty has been truth and freedom right here. The irony being that we went out to places like Afghanistan and Iraq, proclaiming that we were doing them a favor. Oh, the tears for the Muslim oppressed women. Well, a shroud is no better garment than a forced burqa. I don't agree with either. And it beyond sickens me to see some of that rhetoric being revived, because again now, since August, when the troops were officially withdrawn, oh, the poor Afghan women again. Never mind that 200,000 Afghans have been killed, the majority being women and kids. It's all about the women's rights again, to try and cover for the sheer humiliation. It's actually breathtaking. We pat ourselves on the back for getting 2 million people on the streets out in the UK. I don't know what the Afghan people are feeling for having kicked out the Russians, and now the Americans and the whole global alliance having invested the biggest amount of money, resource, manpower, media power, and yet having to leave the country in the most humiliating manner. But that's a testament to the spirit of human beings, actually. Nobody likes to be oppressed. Nobody likes to be colonized. Nobody likes to be bullied. Nobody likes to be told by somebody else that this is how you're going to live your life. And what really sickens me about the likes of Tony Blair, who prostitute themselves to the financiers and the arms dealers, is that they are the spin doctors for the misery and brutality. It's no accident that he gets paid £1 million a year by Mubdala, an organisation which so happens to have tried to gain £1 trillion of resources and minerals from Afghanistan. But he'll talk about values and nice, soft, fluffy things and Western democracy, whilst they imprison Assange in this country, whilst they bring in bills to stop protests, because actually we are the other superpower. They are scared of us. They want to dismiss us, demoralise us, demean us, because they fear us. And I'm not totally interested in the factionalisation of the Labour Party, but I bring it up for this reason. Jeremy Corbyn came close to leading a British government in 2017, which would have been an unapologetic, anti-imperialist, pro-peace government. That was his crime. And that's why they will not rest until they have pushed out, expelled, suspended any Labour Party member who dares share that decent value of humanity, of solidarity, of peace, because they want both the ruling party and the opposing party to be the Tweedledum and Tweedledee, ready to take over from each other, regardless of who is in power. And so 20 years on, I've celebrated my 50th birthday, but it's no time for rest. It's no time for rest because they see us coming this time. But I'm heartened by Extinction Rebellion. I'm heartened by the Black Lives Matter movement. I'm heartened by our young people who've taken the best of what we were doing and have made it their own. And it's our job, I believe, to be supporting them, because demonstrations, as brilliant as they were, and they were the tools that I knew about then, actually are not enough. And I'm going to end with this. If we're really going to stop future wars, if we're really going to stop climate change in its track, if we're really going to get economic, social, political equality and decency, we're going to have to be the workers who refuse to load those ships and airplanes with arms and weaponry. We are going to have to refuse to be the consumers who uphold the economic architecture, which are the foundations and pillars of imperialist wars. So, as usual, it comes back to us, but we are more than enough to take on this burden, because what is at stake is not just our humanity, but the humanity of the planet. So 2 things before I end. Join us, please. I'm going to take a day off. Wednesday, 27th of October, Julian Assange, if we let him be extradited, then that is a huge failure of our movement, as well as indictment of how far the attacks on civil liberties have come since the beginning of this so-called war on terror, which has been a war of terror. So turn up for Julian, make sure he's not extradited, make sure that we have freedom of speech here in this country, never mind preaching it in other countries, and let us join forces with our young people, with Extinction Rebellion, and make sure that these wars, this inhumanity, this brutality can no longer continue in our name. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Salma, Yaqoob. Thank you very much. Well, Salma, I think you've done a lot more than I've done in the last 20 years. That's for sure. our last speaker in this session is a British rapper and activist from my part of London, West London, Lowkey.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you. So, please, I do beg your pardon if I move around a lot. I've just come from a philosophy festival where I had to debate Peter Lilly, so I'm just trying to get the stench out. As Peter Gallison puts it in the book Agnotology, The Making and Unmaking of Ignorance, the classified universe is certainly not smaller and very probably much larger than the unclassified one. In 2001, when the war on terror started alone, you saw 33 million classified actions taken by the US government and $5.5 billion spent to keep those documents classified. Across the last 20 years, we've seen $21 trillion spent by the US on foreign and domestic militarization. However, deaths from terrorism have increased by 4,500%. The war on terror has entailed, on average, 46 bombs being dropped per day and has displaced 37 million people. But when we look at the beast of British militarism, which is married to the beast of US militarism, we can look no further than our political class. Ben Wallace, our current Secretary of Defense during the war on terror for a few years, was the overseas director of arms company Kinetic, which made billions out of the occupation of Afghanistan. Theresa May's own husband, Philip May, was of course working in a very high position for Capital Group, that was the largest shareholder in Lockheed Martin, who increased the value of their stocks by 1,200% through the war on terror. And Lockheed Martin also benefited from the militarization of US and EU borders, thus stopping some of those 37 million people who were displaced by the war. Our Chancellor of the Exchequer, Rishi Sunak, was a partner at the Children's Investment Fund. The Children's Investment Fund owned Lockheed Martin and a company called Safran. Obviously partly, not completely. Now, Safran is the parent company of Securametrics. Securametrics is the company that was tasked by the US government with collecting the biometric data on 80% of the Afghan population. And as was mentioned, Tony Blair, when he appears in the news, it can't be forgotten that he's paid almost $1 million a year by Al-Mubadala, an organization based in the UAE, which had been sizing up $1 trillion worth of minerals in Afghanistan before withdrawal of forces. What about William Hague? He assures us that what happened in Afghanistan must not deter us from future military interventions. What he doesn't mention in his article is that he is also the senior vice president of RUSI, the Royal United Services Institute, which is funded by BAE Systems, Raytheon, Lockheed Martin, Shell, ExxonMobil, and Northrop Grumman. What about Priti Patel? Well, she was paid £1,000 per hour as an advisor to the US defense company Viasat, another company that profited greatly off of these wars. When we talk about Islamophobia, there have been few moments as iconic over these past 20 years as Donald Trump's Muslim ban, but very few looked in the small print of the White House's statement when it identified the studies, the intellectual framework that it was basing the Muslim ban on. It came from an organization called the Center for Security Policy. This organization is funded by by Lockheed Martin and Raytheon. When we look at terrorism as an issue, Major Chris Hunter, an expert for it in the British Army, put it this way: you have 1 in 16 million chance of dying from terrorism in this country. In fact, Baroness Wasi of the Conservative Party said less than 0.1% of Muslims have had anything to do with political violence. Professor Frank Harvey in the United States said you are 4 times more likely to be struck by lightning. In the US context, you are more likely to be killed by a toddler with a gun than by terrorism. Over 95% of terrorism that happens in the world happens in countries like Iraq, Pakistan, Syria, Nigeria. Far more people across the world are killed by other things: one of them being pollution. And just so we can get the scale, in its worst year, terrorism kills 25,000 people globally, but pollution is believed to have killed about 7 million people globally yearly. And now, when we look at the US military as the institution which is the #1 cause of carbon emissions in the world, then clearly we have a major problem here. But when we look at the paradox of British policies, whereby they use Islamophobia domestically to push securitization of populations through the public and the private sector, but they also work to squash the Arab Spring by using mercenary groups within the Middle East. As was pointed out by David Miller, the PREVENT program in schools requires public sector employees to actually contravene the 2010 Equalities Act, because what the Equalities Act says is that you do not have the right to discriminate against somebody because of their political or religious views. And what PREVENT is asking of public sector employees is to, in the guise of what already is required through the duty of care, they are being told that it has to take a racial inflection, which is what PREVENT is about. And that has a direct relation to what Gary Young picks out as 3 attacks against Muslims daily on average in this country. When we look at some of these policies like the Channel, an attempt to kind of algorithmatize Muslim children and how likely they are to become radical. Let's just hear some of the sounds, the signs of vulnerability which are identified. If someone looks sad, depressed, going through changes in their life, students who speak more than usual, students who speak less than usual, students who don't come to class, students who change their clothing, students who get tattoos. Channel Vulnerability Assessment Framework says the following: if someone has feelings of grievance and injustice, if they display a need for identity, a desire for status, a desire for excitement and adventure, a desire for political or moral change, or even being at a transitional time of their life. All of those things are sanctioned by the state for people to be referred to PREVENT. Now, PREVENT opens the space for children to be questioned by police without the foreknowledge of their parents. What has happened to this society? What has happened? And when we talk even further at the extension of this, you have seen a child as young as 13 years old be referred to PREVENT for referring to something he called an eco-terrorist. So it has been extended, and we've seen the leaked report that was looking at including Extinction Rebellion in the PREVENT thing. So we see clearly the Magna Carta, this supposedly great signifier of Britishness, does not apply to some people within our society. And somebody who has been put into that space of rightlessness, which is the terrorist, is of course Julian Assange. You have bipartisan solidarity on that from Mitch McConnell to Joe Biden. Both have referred to him as a high-tech terrorist. That is the reason that he is being treated much in a way not completely dissimilar to those in Guantanamo Bay. He revealed some of those, WikiLeaks revealed some of those cases, and that's the reason, that is the reason that he's being punished today. So, just to end with, we now exist at a time where Britain has around 145 military bases around the world. Prior to the withdrawal from Afghanistan, it had military bases in 5 countries neighboring China. British militarism refuses to die, but they forget that World War I ended in mutinies. It ended with the SS Jolly George, where people refused to load weapons onto ships to go and strangle the Russian Revolution in its cradle, as Churchill said. Also, they forget Greenham Common, where today there is a plaque not marking the presence of the US base, but marking the presence of the women's campaign who stood there and resisted. We are on the right side of history. We're on the right side of history. We've beaten them before, and we will beat them again. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Lowkey. Thank you very much. Often our job is to give history lessons to the right. I found myself doing that with Ian Duncan Smith on Thursday night on LBC. And it wasn't it wasn't something I particularly enjoyed. Can we finally thank all our speakers, Weyman, John, Salma, and Lowkey again? And I'll hand it over now to Shelly.
Thanks, Murad, and hello again, comrades. Before we kick off with the final session, I do just want to hand over to a very dear friend of Stop the War, a fantastic comedian, Alexei Sayle, who's going to say a few words.
Thank you. It's good to be here. It's only about 2 minutes from my house. So happy 20th anniversary War on Terror. Yeah, I don't often make speeches because, as you can see, I just confuse people. I think it's well known that if Jeremy Corbyn, and Jeremy can confirm this, had been elected in 2019, then I would have been in his cabinet. But not as many assumed as Arts Minister, but as Minister for Defence. The reason for this is that I am one of the few left-wingers who has a detailed and rather creepy knowledge and is fascinated by weapons and the arms industry. Now, in my stand-up and on my podcast, and Lowkey talked a lot about the arms industry, I'm going to talk about a slightly separate aspect of it. In my stand-up, I've talked about the 2 aircraft carriers Britain has built at a cost of £8 billion that have no planes on them. One, of course, is called the Queen Elizabeth. The other one is called the Prince of Wales. Prince of Wales. I think the Prince of Wales is sailing along an aircraft carrier with no aircraft on him. It is attacked by the navy of another mighty military power, Malawi, say. What's it going to do? Fire fucking organic biscuits at them? When the Queen Elizabeth and the Prince of Wales are finally equipped with aircraft, those aircraft will be the F-35 Lightning II, the jet they call the plane that broke the Pentagon. A plane that cost hundreds of billions of dollars so far and has great difficulty taking off, flying anywhere, or landing. The Royal Navy Type 45 destroyers, the new destroyers, have engines that stop if it gets hot, leaving them completely defenseless. And you've also got the Army's new armoured fighting vehicle that makes its occupants sick and can only go at half speed. The people who bought all this crap are the same people, the Joint Chiefs of Staff, who've been all over the media in the past few weeks defending the idea of interventionist war. Both Johnson and indeed Starmer have tried to ally belief and pride in being British with the senior military in the arms industry. But the real patriots are you people here. Those who know it's not just the shonky, overpriced garbage the UK arms industry produces that doesn't work, but that war itself doesn't work. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Alexei. I think that... And there he is, Prime Minister with the Minister of Defence. Thank you so much, Alexei. I think that was just what we needed. Can I now ask the final panellists to come and join me on stage? Now, this last session is looking to the future of the anti-war movement. And I know we're running over, so I have to be very, very strict with the speakers, so apologies in advance because I will be cutting you off around 5 minutes. Now, our first speaker who I'd like to introduce is an activist. He's played a key role in organising the massive mobilisations against Trump when he came to London, the massive Palestine mobilisations that we saw over the summer recently. He's a fellow officer of Stop the War, Shabbir Lakha.
Thank you very much, Shelly, and thanks everyone. It's great to be here with you today. I was planning to make a few jokes, but thankfully Alexei has covered that, so I can keep it bland. I'll just start by saying greetings and solidarity to you all. I think when we're thinking about the future, I think it's important to reiterate some of the points that we've heard today and remember why we are here today in this hall. And we're here to commemorate two things. The first is 20 years of brutal and catastrophic wars waged by the West in pursuit of global dominance. 20 years of the occupation of Afghanistan, of over 300,000 bombs dropped, at least 70,000 civilians killed, and millions displaced, didn't get rid of the Taliban, it didn't bring democracy, it didn't protect women. The occupation of Iraq, which left 1 million people dead, the bombardment of Libya, which killed at least 30,000 people, and has created a lawless state where now in 2021 there is an actual human slave trade. These wars and those in Syria, Somalia, Yemen, Pakistan all have one thing in common, and that is that they have been utter failures. Today, those countries have been absolutely devastated and the terrorism has spread. New and worse terrorist groups have emerged, like ISIS, and have been able to recruit primarily because of the growing anti-Western sentiment as a result of these wars. As we saw with the Arab Spring 10 years ago and with Afghanistan now, the biggest inhibitor to the peoples of these countries being able to determine their future and create democracy has been Western intervention. Now, the second thing we're commemorating is 20 years of the anti-war movement, 20 years of resisting these wars at every step. We know the impact that we have had in shaping public opinion, in creating a permanent campaigning force that continues to resonate with millions of people across the country, and in limiting the ability of our rulers to launch the kinds of wars and occupations that they did in Afghanistan and Iraq. We know that today there is the highest level of public support for Palestine in Britain, anywhere in the West, because in 2003, when we marched 2 million people against the Iraq war, our banner said, "Don't attack Iraq, freedom for Palestine." Because we mobilized en masse when Gaza was under attack, and because we have staunchly been principled in our opposition to apartheid and occupation. This year alone, we saw 3 of the biggest mobilizations for Palestine, and we know that they were of central importance in causing Israel to call a ceasefire and in showing the Palestinian resistance that they had popular international support. And of course, as has been said, we've been absolutely right to put campaigning against Islamophobia and against the demonization of refugees front and center of our movement. And you can look at France, for example, to see what happens when you don't. We were right to campaign against the attacks on civil liberties, the Islamophobic Prevent agenda, which Lowkey talked about in such detail, Guantanamo Bay, which still remains open, and the rendition flights. These are all products of the war on terror. And there is a direct authoritarian trajectory between those and the continued erosion of our rights that we see today. The Investigatory Powers Act, the Spy Cops Bill, the Overseas Operations Act, the jailing of whistleblowers like Julian Assange and Chelsea Manning, the Police and Crime Bill, which is just going through Parliament right now, and the 2-tier citizenship that the Tories have de facto created with their treatment of Shamima Begum. So we have to make this the biggest possible "we bloody told you so" moment that we possibly can. Because we need to remind ourselves, we need to remind the politicians, and importantly, we need to remind the population at large that we were right, that the people were right and our rulers were wrong. And yet, our politicians, present company excluded, have learned absolutely nothing. They lament the end of the war in Afghanistan. They cry crocodile tears for the women who are now living under Taliban rule, who for the last 20 years they've been bombing. The Tories have this year increased defense spending by £16.5 billion, while claiming that there's no money for a pay rise for nurses or to maintain the uplift to universal credit, or to not raise national insurance for the poorest workers, so that they can increase our nuclear arsenal by 40%, so that they can send their military flotilla to the South China Sea, so that they can continue airstrikes in Afghanistan, Iraq, and Syria. And that's why it's so important that there is going to be an anti-war bloc on the People's Assembly demonstration in 2 weeks' time in Manchester, Because, yeah, because the arguments against war and austerity are completely intertwined, and we need to bring together all the different strands of opposition. So I hope that applause means you'll all be in Manchester, and if you're not planning to already, there's some leaflets at the back, please get down there. And this moment of defeat hasn't been a wake-up call for the political class to admit that they were wrong, but rather the decline of Western imperialism is a moment for them to seek new arenas of warfare, to attempt to maintain their waning hegemony. And we can see this with the ramping up of tensions and the encircling of China. So we have to be the ones to remind them how wrong they were and are. And we can never allow people to believe that these corrupt warmongers know better than us, that there is anything benevolent about their aims, or that we are powerless to stop them. We know what a threat we are because we saw the extent that they went to smear Jeremy Corbyn and our movement because we stood against their imperialism. The threat of more war continues. The danger of increasing militarism continues. The worsening reality of occupation, apartheid, and siege in Palestine continues. The mass murder, the drowning of refugees, the Islamophobia and racism on our streets all continue. The mass polluting by our militaries continues, but so must our movement. If there's one lesson that we must learn from the last 20 years, it is that we have the power. Our strength is in our solidarity and our principles. And if anything, we need to build a stronger, more determined, more organized movement now more than ever. The mobilization against the Iraq war didn't come from nowhere. It came from a whole year of public meetings and marches up and down the country. And that's what we need to get back to. We need to have local groups in every town and city. We need to be putting on these public meetings. We need to be demonstrating. We need to stay on the streets, not least because every protest we have now is a defiance against their bill to clamp down on our right to protest. And, sorry, I'm wrapping up. And, that's where I was. Yeah, and we need to bring back, school students and trade unions back into our movement in a big way. So I'll leave with this to just say that we have a fight on our hands. We know we were right. We know we have the power. So we need to keep fighting. We need to keep building, and together we can win. Solidarity.
Thank you so much, Shabbir, for all your dedication to this campaign. And let's hear it for Chris coming through with the clean glasses. Now, Peter Brierley was absolutely right earlier when he said how fantastic it is to see new faces and young people getting involved in this campaign. And it was through the student movement that I actually got involved with Stop the War. And I was really proud of the role that we played in the National Union of Students in supporting Palestine against the war in Syria at the time and opposing the prevent duty that Lowkey spoke so eloquently about earlier. During the 2003 Iraq war demonstration, there were leading members of the NUS who spoke on that demonstration, but the current NUS president was only 5 years old at the time, so you can forgive her perhaps for her absence. But I'm really pleased that she is here today to speak to us about the wonderful work that the NUS is still doing on divestment in particular. Please welcome NUS President Larrisa Kennedy.
Thank you so much, Shelly. In that respect, we are standing on the shoulders of giants over at NUS, and so it is a great pleasure to be with you. As Shelly mentioned, I'm 23. A lot of my members are 16, they're 18, they're 20. We are young people who have inherited a society, inherited a world where we think that it's acceptable that militarism, violence, and war are just part of the functioning of our world. That's not what we want. That's not the world that we want to continue to live in. And we talked a lot today about the government's responsibility, how the government is directly complicit in this harm, in this violence. But it's not just our governments. Our universities hold £15 billion of wealth, and these institutions, as we know them today, are the very product of historical genocide, enslavement, displacement, colonialism, and imperialism. I'll state in no uncertain terms that the UK higher education sector would not exist without the historical and ongoing violence that people of colour have experienced. All of that violence is sewn into the fabric of our education system. These are supposed to be education providers. They're supposed to be pouring into us so that we can go out into the world and build something better, build something new collectively. And yet, the Study War No More report, it shows that 26 universities at the time had received funding from military organizations. It showed that they are in the pockets of BAE Systems, that they're in the pockets of all of these companies that are harming our siblings, that are killing our siblings. And so when I'm saying education providers, it's because the marketized university, these institutions with the funding models that they have, they are tied to the premise that profit comes before all else. They are tied to the premise that people of color's lives here and across the world do not matter. So it's about how do we now uproot that? How do we build anew? How do we as students connect with our communities, connect with all of you in the room here today, connect with the people that you're connected with to change it for the better? We have to latch on to anything that is more than this. It's about re-envisioning our education institutions, but re-envisioning our world. It's about moving on from the idea that decolonization and, the way that it's framed by this mainstream right-wing media, the idea that decolonization is, we're trying to take away history, that we're trying to rewrite history. We're trying to rewrite the future. We're trying to... We want to rewrite a world that is free from war, free from violence, free from harm. And to do that, we have to start with divestment. We have to start by uprooting the ways that racism, the Islamophobia, they are sewn into the fabric of the way that we move, the way that we learn, the things that we learn. Lowkey was speaking before about the prevent duty and the ridiculous number of things on which students can be pulled up on. But let's look at the impact of that. Because NUS did prior some research that showed that 43% of Muslim students don't feel that they can speak out, that they can speak freely. So Muslim students in our education system, they're not allowed to critique war. They're not allowed to critique violence. They're not allowed to critique the capitalist motivations of these wars because that would be too disruptive. That would be too disruptive to a system that thrives not on freedom of speech, as this government likes to pretend, but thrives on pretending that war is normal, that the fact that we want to harm and push imperial logics on the rest of the world is normal. It's not. So ultimately, the student movement continues to stand in solidarity with everyone at the Stop the War, but everyone around the world who is re-envisioning something better. We are seeking the abolition of the university as we know it as a route through to building anew, as a route through to standing in solidarity tangibly with our siblings who are bearing the brunt of militarism. But we also need to work with our communities to build the grassroots mass movement that we need that's capable of democratizing, and decolonizing our education so that we can build sites of learning and knowledge that are centered on care, justice, and liberation, not just for us, but for everyone around the world. And that's what we're seeking to do. And I hope to keep joining you together in this collective fight.
I think it's safe to say that the student movement is in safe hands with Larrisa. Thank you so much, Larrisa, for being here. Our next speaker is another young comrade who was also in primary school when this campaign was founded. And I know her through both being involved in the student movement through the National Union of Students, where she was a leading anti-racist activist in particular. And I hope she won't mind me sharing this story, but one of my most memorable moments of that time was there was a very small group of maybe about 10 of us linking arms in the middle of the road outside the headquarters of G4S, there to stop the traffic in protest of their complicity in the imprisonment of Palestinians. We shut the traffic down that morning. But that HQ of G4S is now also the headquarters of the Labour Party, and this young lady is now a Labour Party MP. It is my honour to introduce Zarah Sultana MP. Thank you, Zarah.
Hi everyone. I just said to Larrisa, there's no way I can top that. I have an incredibly difficult act to follow. And I just want to say thank you to Shelly for that introduction. I was very much shaped by my time in the National Union of Students, from shutting down Victoria Street to going to Calais to do a refugee solidarity action, visiting Auschwitz with United Against Fascism. And I am that person today because of all of those experiences. And it's an absolute privilege to be here with you all today, marking not just 20 years of the war on terror, but 20 years of Stop the War. And 2 decades on, let us not be in any doubt, the wars unleashed by Bush and Blair haven't vindicated the pundits and the politicians who clamoured for conflict. It vindicated Stop the War and peace activists who proved to be right time and time again. So thank you for leading the campaign against Western imperialism and aggression, and for inviting me to speak today. As Shelly mentioned, I was just 7 years old around September the 11th, 2001, and that atrocity had an impact that cast a long shadow over my childhood and also as an adult. The war on terror set a narrative that portrayed Muslims, wherever we were, as a security threat in need of discipline and subordination. We weren't seen as equals, we weren't seen as people who deserved dignity or respect, but as suspects, as a threat, and through the prism of counterterrorism and security. Growing up, I saw the effects of this, not just at home, but also abroad. Because at home, what it meant was rising Islamophobia and the erosion of civil liberties of everyone in society. It meant the installation of cameras, security cameras, on streets near my childhood home. And while the authorities said they were for traffic calming measures, we soon learned that that wasn't true. This was a Muslim majority area, and these security cameras were to spy on the community. Then at school and university, I encountered Prevent, as mentioned by Larrisa and Lowkey and many others. We were told that Prevent was going to target radicalization, but when we see young girls refer to it for choosing to wear a hijab, we know that it's really about demonizing and silencing Muslims. And abroad, this Islamophobic narrative set the background to disastrous wars, with Muslim-majority countries portrayed as threats, as unprogressive, and these wars and this carnage, we've seen it in Afghanistan, we've seen it in Iraq, Libya, and many more places. It has claimed the lives of millions of people, it has forced millions more to flee their homes, and it has destabilized whole regions. It didn't bring democracy or security to the Middle East, nor did it make us any safer at home. And as Jeremy bravely argued in the 2017 election, as well as academic experts, the security services themselves, even Boris Johnson, when he was London mayor, there is a close connection between the wars on terror abroad and the threat of terrorism at home. "20 years later, you think people had time to digest all of this, and you think some of these lessons might have been learnt by the powerful and the ruling class. You think that the same old tired arguments that have been refuted beyond all doubt in these years would be abandoned. You'd think that, right? But in Parliament, as we've all seen, when Parliament was recalled in the summer for the debate on Afghanistan, that's not quite what's happened, because one after another, MPs from across the House got up and they demanded more military intervention, as if the answer to catastrophic war is more catastrophic war. Just as in 2001, our political class still believes that liberal democracy can be built at the barrel of British and American guns. That fantasy was wildly implausible back then, as Stop the War, Jeremy, and a handful of other MPs recognized. But to hold this belief now, in 2021, after all the bloodshed that has been unleashed, it is absolutely ludicrous as it is dangerous. So I spoke in that debate to tell a hard, clear truth, a truth that we all subscribe to, that British bombs cannot build democracy and our politicians must never again send soldiers to kill and die in futile crusades. But while our political class don't get it, the public definitely does, because poll after poll, poll after poll of the British public shows that most people oppose these wars, that they show that most people opposed continuous military occupation, and even Joe Biden and the Democrats don't want forever wars. I can't believe we are saying that Americans, the American president, has a better line on this than most politicians in Westminster, but that's where we are. While we must argue now that Afghanistan, the very first war on terror, should be the very last war on terror, this week we know that those arguments have to keep being made because we saw a new front to Western militarism. We saw the Australia-UK-US pact now putting China firmly in focus again, setting up a new dangerous Cold War. This saber-rattling won't bring any peace as much as they tell us and keep telling us. It won't secure justice or human rights. And just as it did before, a new Cold War risks hot wars across the world, most likely in the global south, and the danger of nuclear Armageddon engulfing us all. So I'm sad to say it, but stop the war and the movement for peace is just as important, if not more important, than it was 20 years ago. So I join you. So I join you today and every day in continuing the fight for a new foreign policy that is based not on military might and bloodshed, but restraint, diplomacy, and securing peace and justice for everyone, wherever they are in the world. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Zarah. It's fantastic to have you here today, and it's fantastic to have you in Parliament as one of those few anti-war voices fighting the fight on our behalf. Thank you. Now, not everyone on this panel was a child when this campaign was formed. Some of us were helping found it, and of course, for many years, chaired it as well. And it was only, he only resigned that commitment when he later became leader of the Labour Party, of course. But he remains a leader of the anti-war movement. And he's here to talk about Stop the War, the last 20 years, but he's also, of course, here to talk about the future. And, of course, he recently founded the Project for Peace and Justice. He needs no introduction, of course. Thank you for being here, Jeremy Corbyn.
Thank you, Shelly, and thank you all for being here today at this amazing 20 years on since the founding of the Stop the War Coalition. To me, it is like a sort of big family reunion, because what we have achieved over 20 years has to become an important and very significant part of democratic society, that we speak for peace, we speak for justice, we speak for human rights. When I became leader of the Labour Party, I was asked by a journalist a couple of days later, Mr. Corbyn, I assume you've already resigned from CND and Stop the War, and he listed a whole lot of other organisations, some of which I didn't know I was a member of, but I thought, well, I probably would have joined them if I'd been asked to. So I said, absolutely no. Why should I? He said, because it will cloud your judgment. I said, it will inform my judgment to build a world of peace, not of war. And if you'll permit me for just a minute or two to say something about those founding days of the Stop the War movement, because this lovely document about the 20 Years War on Terror programme for today's event lists the people we should particularly thank. I know them all well, and I do thank them all massively. I just want to draw attention to those that are sadly no longer with us. Our great friend Tony Benn, the wonderful Robin Best, my great friend Tam Diel, Helen John, who did so much for CND and the peace movement, my personal great friend Mike Marquisey, whose books are now on sale at Houseman's Bookshop, and of course the wonderful late great Walter Wolfgang, who gave us so much wisdom. Those people gave their all their life, to try and bring about a better and just world. And I just think we should remember those contributions that are made. I'd also like to say a personal thank you to the group that's sitting down there, the gang of four that's sitting down there, Chris, John, Lindsey, and Andrew. Thank you so much. Stand up, come on, stand up, please. For just being fantastic comrades over all these years and always being prepared to go that extra mile. And Lindsey and I sort of outbid each other on an arcane knowledge of the last train back to London from God knows where, God knows when, because we were very good at missing them in all the hundreds of meetings we've done to Stop the War Coalition. But that amazing founding meeting in Friends Meeting House on Euston Road, where Tariq and Bruce Kent and Tony, of course, and so many others spoke at, came in the wake of the devastation of 9/11. What happened in New York was disgusting, disgraceful, and utterly wrong under any circumstances. And so nobody was condoning anything like that. But our answer was to learn the lesson and build a world of peace, not start another war. And that's why I'm so full of admiration for Barbara Lee, the only US Congress member to vote against Bush's War Powers Act in September 2001. And so we established the Stop the War Coalition. We were astounded at the number of people that came to that meeting. I think there were 3,000. I made the same speech 5 times in one evening because the hall wasn't big enough, but that's okay. I hope it got better as it went on. And we also mobilized people in a cultural, music, artistic way also, because you don't win a political fight in a political argument without mobilizing people where they are to bring them to where we all should be. You don't just do it by dictate and diktat. You bring people together in their own environments. And that, I think, we're particularly good at. But debates on the left about patriotism, going to war or not, and supporting your country irrespective are not exactly new. There was a fascinating and wonderful article in the Morning Star on Wednesday saying that the first split of the left on war was actually in 1884 over whether or not the government of the day should send an expedition to free General Gordon, who was being held under siege in Khartoum. Some of the left, a very small number, said, yes, that was the right thing to do because he was British, therefore we had to save him. Well, they did send an expedition. He was long dead by the time they got there. And the expedition itself just proved the folly of the whole operation. But the same year, 1884, the Congress of Berlin took place, which drew with pencil and ruler all those lines on the map of Africa, which decided which European country would grab which part of Africa for its own benefit. It was the failure of some of the left to recognize that fighting for socialism and social justice in your own country also requires you to fight against imperialism and injustice in other parts of the world. And so we went to war in Afghanistan. We bombed, we destroyed, we killed, we bribed, we damaged, we destroyed. And then, 20 years later, British troops have left, American troops have left, others have gone long before. I hold no brief for the Taliban, I hold no brief for those that deny rights to others. But I do hold a brief for the right of people in their own country, in their own society, to decide their future, not have it decided for them by international military alliances for their own ends. And so we then, somehow or other, Blair and Bush decided that Iraq was the same as Afghanistan. And somebody said to me on a radio program in probably 2001, 2002 time, they said, Mr. Corbyn, what have Osama bin Laden and Saddam Hussein got in common? I said, there's one thing they've definitely got in common. He said, what's that? He was thinking I was going to say something interesting. I said, they both hate each other and both want to kill each other. And they then bigged up the idea that Iraq was a threat to the world with weapons of mass destruction. Remember those crazy maps which showed a weapon of mass destruction taking off from Baghdad and landing on Portsmouth 45 minutes later, and so on and so on. And our media, our supine, complicit mainstream media went along with all of that. With some extent, this is not, and I promise you, this is not an attack on journalists, it's not an attack on free speech. I just say that media that is controlled by global interests like Murdoch seem to be more interested in supporting administrations doing the wrong thing than exposing the truth, as Julian Assange has found out to his cost with the years that he's been in prison. And so we went to war in Iraq, and we had that massive demonstration just before the war started. It was amazing. It was the first time in global history there was a global demonstration. We need to think about this, and we need to do it again. That global demonstration, 600 cities all around the world with a timeline of the same time for a demonstration. But there was one city that couldn't do it the same day because they had some other festival on that day, and that was San Francisco. And so I willingly and then reluctantly, and I thought it was crazy, said that I would go and speak in San Francisco the day after the Stop the War demonstration in London. So I had to run through the crowd at the end of the demonstration in Hyde Park to get a train from Paddington, to get to Heathrow, to squeeze onto the plane, last passenger getting on, get to New York, and the whole place is snowed in. Mike Marcus, he told me I could stay in a flat with him and other friends in Manhattan. I went there. They'd had a great party after their demonstration. They didn't hear me knocking on the door. So I'm out there standing in the snow, unable to get anywhere to stay, while this lot are partying inside. Not very nice. Uncomradely, I call it. And then somehow or other we managed to get the last plane to San Francisco the next day. Massive, massive, massive demonstration. Joan Baez, Bonnie Raitt, and many others speaking there. That was the global power of the anti-war and the Stop the War movement. Now, I know it didn't stop the war in Iraq, but just as a generation was formed in solidarity in this very room with the Spanish Civil War in the 1930s, those who formed their politics opposing the war in Vietnam in the 1960s and 70s, those that marched against the Iraq War and against the war on terror and the whole Bush-Blair project have never forgotten it and have learnt a lot from it. And that political hinterland is there for all time, and it's there for us to develop it even further. And so I simply say this. When people say we're unpatriotic, I simply reply this. I was asked a question in the last election by the Daily Mail. Mr. Corbyn, you're not patriotic, are you? I said, well, that's not a very good question. You ought to ask me if I am patriotic or not. And I said, yes, I'm very patriotic, actually, extremely patriotic. Prove it. How? I said, my patriotism is not leaving a fellow citizen sleeping in the streets, homeless and hungry. Children going hungry. Young people sent to war they shouldn't be sent to. It is about solidarity and protecting and supporting each other. That surely has to be the right way to do it. And I'm being reminded that it's time to finish, so I will. Thank you, Chair. You're very kind. I promised you I'd be on time, and now I'm not. I just finished with this. Last year, the killing of George Floyd, the growth of Black Lives Matters, and the development of a global anti-racist movement changed an awful lot of people's opinions and mind. People under oppression the world over saw in themselves the way in which black people in the United States have been treated, and they saw in themselves the hope for something better. So, 2 days after this latest Cold War has been announced against China, with nuclear submarines from Australia, Britain, and the USA in the South China Sea. That's going to be an arms race bonanza for the arms companies of Britain, France, and the United States. It's going to be a bonanza for those that manufacture arms in China and in Russia. We're into some crazy world where we're increasing armament at a time when we should be getting over COVID, protecting the environment, getting over global inequality, providing water, sanitation, and health care for all. And so our answer to this is learn the lessons, the hard lessons of not always being able to stop the conflicts we tried to stop, but learn the lessons that we can stop the next one and mobilize people like never before against this new Cold War, against this rearmament, against injustice and inequality, but above all, on a global sense, an anti-racist sense, an anti-imperialist sense, and above all, give people hope and space, because hope and space is what will bring about real change in this world. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Jeremy, for that contribution, for the contribution that you've made and the contributions that you continue to make.
I'd just like to make an announcement. It was Shelly's birthday and she's going out celebrating tonight. That means two things. We've got her a cake. I've left it in the box because we haven't got any candles. And it will be easier for her to move. Secondly, she'll say a few words to you, but we do need to leave the hall quite quickly. So happy birthday, Shelly, and thanks everybody for coming.
Wow. Thank you so much. It looks delicious. Thank you so much. That's so kind, Lindsey. I just wanted to take your attention for one more moment. I want to thank this panel, Zarah, Larrisa, Shabbir, and Jeremy. And I want to thank everybody who's spoken today. But I also want to say thank you to Tarina, Grace, and Maya, who work in the Stop the War office and who make this and all the other things that we do possible. So big thank you to them. Finally, if you're not running the London Marathon on the 3rd of October, then I hope to see you on the streets of Manchester for the protest outside the Tory party conference. We'll be there with a Stop the War banner and you can join us on the anti-war block. Finally, if you're not a member of Stop the War yet, what you're playing at, you can join outside. You can affiliate your union branch. Jeremy's going to be my lovely assistant here with the affiliation form. And you can also donate. As I mentioned earlier, fantastic, glamorous assistant. You can join using the QR code, which is on your flyer, or you can do it the old-fashioned way and put some money in the bucket on your way out. Thank you once again, comrades. Get home safe.